Welcome to Crimson Tales. Support me by subscribing my channel and like, comment, share my videos. 28 June, 4 days after Little Hangleton. The headmaster's office. Harry paused at a conveniently placed mirror just across from the gargoyle that guarded the entrance to the headmaster's office. He was already late, but as the boy was a bit cross with Professor Dumbledore at the moment, he put being presentable ahead of being punctual and so took the time to adjust his green and silver necktie and pat down the few hairs that had slipped out of place. Pottermen were known for their famously unruly hair, which was one of many reasons why he was glad he no longer carried that name. Satisfied with his appearance, Hadrian Rumpelstiltskin, Harry to his friends, his teachers, and pretty much everyone else in the world except for a tiny handful of particularly officious bureaucrats, turned to the gargoyle and gave the password, Goo Goo Clusters, some ghastly-sounding American confection the headmaster had discovered, and then ascended the stairs. "Come in, Harry," said Dumbledore from inside the office before Harry even had time to knock. The young Slytherin sighed. He'd never be so uncouth as to say anything, but privately, he'd always thought it rude for the headmaster to always invite people in before they could actually knock, the wily old man's way of asserting dominance over visitors before they even made it inside his office. Also, it had been 4 days since the disastrous end of the Triwizard Tournament. They kept the original name in all papers for some silly reason despite the added participants, and only now had the headmaster finally decided it was time to speak with him again. A bit lax, Harry thought, what with a lunatic snake man back from the dead and running around loose with an army of inbred pureblood terrorists and all. Not that he had been looking forward to this meeting. Harry had forgiven Dumbledore years before for his indirect role in placing him with the Dursleys, but the Slytherin was still continually annoyed by the headmaster's efforts to get him back on good terms with the family he'd simultaneously been thrown out of and proudly walked away from, and thus, Harry was not surprised by the tableau before him when he opened the door. In the center of the room was Dumbledore, who for once wasn't twinkling madly at Harry, but was instead looking quite somber. Indeed, today, the headmaster actually seemed to look his age. For just a second, Harry felt almost concerned, but then he remembered he had reason to be annoyed with the man, and suppressed a charitable influence. Bad enough, the Dark Lord is back, but for him to use Dumbledore's tournament to achieve it, and with the aid of someone the headmaster had considered a friend who turned out to be a Death Eater operating right under his nose? Ridiculous. That would never have happened if Dumbledore had been a Slytherin. Then, annoyed with his own annoyance, Harry took a second to center himself. Unbridled emotion is the enemy of cunning and the foe of ambition, Slytherin's memoirs had said, and they were words Harry had tried to live by pretty much since the day he first read them. If he did embroidery, the quote would be hanging over his bed in framed needlepoint. In any case, Voldemort's rise made Harry and Dumbledore into allies, whatever their past conflicts. To Dumbledore's right was an empty chair, apparently meant for him. Sitting next to it were two figures Harry was pleased to see, Severus Snape and Sirius Black. Snape, of course, was Harry's head of house. After a rough introduction, Harry and the potions master settled into a truce that eventually blossomed into a relatively warm, for Slytherins anyway, mentor-apprentice relationship. Lord Black, pale and gaunt, still bore the signs of years of false imprisonment in Azkaban, but that hadn't prevented him from adopting Harry as his heir to the shock and horror of most of Wizarding Britain. Harry thought his role in successfully springing Sirius out of Azkaban and into a lordship was one of his proudest moments, exceeded only by the monumental task of getting Snape and Black past their adolescent hatred and into an uneasy alliance. It helped that the three of them had mutual enemies. Speaking of whom, to the left of the headmaster's desk sat the Potters, James, Lily, and their son, James Jr. Jem to his friends, the boy who lived to his adoring public, the supreme git of the universe, according to the t-shirt Harry had sent to him for his 13th birthday. Ostensibly Harry's identical twin, the two could easily be told apart by Jim's atrocious hair, his relentlessly Gryffindorish attitude towards life, and the small jagged scar on his left temple that resembled the letter V. Harry had a scar of his own, of course, but one which was generally attributed to falling masonry, a lightning bolt having no apparent connection to the Dark Lord. Or so most people thought. Harry's ancient runes professor knew perfectly well that the lightning bolt scar couldn't have been a better representation of Savilo, the Norse rune of power and victory, if somebody carved it deliberately. But being as cunning as any Slytherin herself, she had hoarded that information, knowledge being power after all. As Harry entered, the Potter father and son turned to look at him with angry glares, as characteristic as they were predictable. Honestly, he thought, it's not my fault they both kept trusting the wrong people. Lily Potter didn't glare at her eldest son, but Harry avoided eye contact with her nonetheless. The reasons for the gulf between her and Harry were very different from those separating Harry from his former father and brother, but they were perhaps even more insurmountable. "You're late," said James coolly. "Am I?" Harry replied cheerfully as he took the empty seat. "Actually, I don't recall being given a specific time to be here. Just instructions to come as soon as possible. I went to see how Theo was doing, and then came straight away."
"That's no excuse."
"Yes, thank you, Lord Potter." Harry said even more cheerfully, and with the smile he usually reserved for people he thought were too thick for subtlety. Your observations have been noted. I will endeavor to be more punctual in the future. Then he turned to the headmaster while his birth father fumed. Happily, I'm here now. Headmaster? Dumbledore was uncharacteristically silent for several seconds. Harry crooked an eyebrow. Finally, he spoke. Before we get to that, tell me, how is young Theo doing? Harry's smile faltered for a second before reasserting itself. The school's treatment of Theo had been a sore topic with him for some time. While that wasn't Dumbledore's fault, he certainly didn't do much to help. Theo No-Name is doing as well as can be expected, sir. I don't know if Sirius has told you, but assuming the final legal hurdles can be worked out, he'll be formally adopting him as Theo Black, which I think is excellent, because frankly, I've always wanted a brother. Harry fought down the temptation to sneer at Jim with that last dig. After all, he'd been on a campaign for some time now to get all the other Slytherins to sneer less often. Anyway, it was a lie. Like Neville, Theo had already been his brother in every way that mattered for years. Of course, there was that brief interval when Harry actually thought that he and Jim, but no, that was over, and there was no sense brooding over it. Jim snorted. You snakes deserve each other, he muttered. You can get matching dark marks. Harry rolled his eyes. Apparently, the other boy was still upset at what happened in the graveyard at Little Hangleton, even though Harry's Slytherin cunning had saved both their lives after Jim's Gryffindor hero complex had once again led them into disaster. Typical, really. Sirius growled audibly in response to Jim's dig, and James tensed in response. Luckily, before the wands came out, Dumbledore snapped. Enough! All of you! The time for this dissension is past. The Dark Lord has returned. A fact the Ministry of Magic refuses to acknowledge. Voldemort is drawing his Death Eaters to his side even as we speak. Things have changed. Dumbledore's voice broke on that last word, surprising everyone present who had always considered the headmaster a monument of self-control. As part of that, Jim, you will cease this constant badgering of your brother and of the other Slytherins. While it is true that Slytherin House has always had strong ties to the Dark Lord in the past, I cannot deny what Harry has done to persuade many of his housemates and even their families to reject Voldemort now, and I will not have those fragile alliances undermined by the bigotries of House Potter that I have tolerated for too long. Jim shrank into his seat, as did his father, his outburst over. Dumbledore seemed to deflate as his anger faded. For his part, Harry's eyes widened. He'd never seen Dumbledore talk that way, the boy who lived before. Now then, before we get to the primary purpose of this meeting, I'd first like to discuss the current attitudes of the DMLE and the Wizengamot towards the announcement of Voldemort's return. We may not have an opportunity to speak of such things later. Black and Potter Sr. looked at each other coolly before Sirius nodded at his former friend. James turned back to Dumbledore and started his report on the state of the DMLE. Harry leaned back into his chair. Things have changed, Dumbledore had said. Harry looked over to the three people who were supposed to have been his family, but somehow they were never quite up to the job, so he finally gave up them and went out to find a family of his own. Some things would never change. As his birth father's voice droned on in the background, Harry thought about the choices, some his own, most made by others, that had brought him here. 31 October. Peter Pettigrew slowly picked up himself up off the ground and surveyed the wreckage of the Potter home in amazement. He had sworn allegiance to Voldemort just a week before, bartering the secret James and Lily Potter had entrusted to him in exchange for a seat high in the Dark Lord's Council. Voldemort had chosen tonight as the most auspicious time to kill the Potters and the prophecy child they protected, and he'd insisted that Peter accompany him to Godric's Hollow. The traitor remained across the street and watched as his master glided through the wards on Godric's Hollow and forced his way inside. There was a brief flurry of spellfire, and then silence that lasted for a moment or two, until a titanic explosion blew away part of the second floor with enough force to knock Peter to the ground. After recovering from both surprise and the loud ringing in his ears, Peter closed his eyes and concentrated. There was a soft pop, and then a Norwegian brown rat appeared in his place and quickly darted across to the Potter home. Once inside, Peter resumed his human form and began his investigation. To his great surprise, he soon discovered first James and then Lily Potter, both stupefied, along with two infant children. It was decidedly unlike Voldemort to use a stunning hex rather than a killing curse, but Peter assumed his master had his reasons. Of the Dark Lord, there was nothing left but a pile of ragged clothing and a wand on the floor of the second-floor nursery. Peter pocketed the wand inside his robes. The animagus descended the stairs and sat down on a love seat near the prone body of his former friend, James Potter, muttering curses as he went. Typical, he thought. I finally commit myself to the Death Eaters fully, and Voldemort immediately gets himself blown up. So now, what do I do? Peter sniggered softly to himself. I suppose I could turn into a rat full-time. Find some wizarding child that needs a pet or something. At least I'd stay fed and out of Azkaban. He shook his head to clear it and then closed his eyes in concentration. Then he looked down at James's prone body and smiled. The decision to switch secret keepers from Sirius to Peter had only been made just a fortnight before, and James had been insistent that no one know about the switch, not even Dumbledore. If they'd truly kept the switch hidden, he might have the chance to have his cake and eat it too. Peter cracked his knuckles as he studied James intently. Then he reached into a pocket and pulled out a small box, which he placed on the coffee table. He tapped it once with his wand, and it grew to its normal size, a wooden chest about foot across. From inside, the traitor removed a small vial containing a purple liquid that had been gifted to him by a fellow Death Eater who called himself Mr. Nemo. Peter smiled again. Most of the Death Eaters with whom he'd become acquainted could charitably be described as psychotic morons. Mr. Nemo, like Mr. Toymaker and Misdirection, were also quite mad, but decidedly not morons. Peter carried the vial over to James's prone body and pried his mouth open before pouring a few drops of the purple fluid down his throat. Then, he pressed his wand to James's temple. The Aurors knew ways of detecting memory-altering charms inflicted upon their own, but Mr. Nemo had assured Peter that any mind-altering spell cast in conjunction with his little miracle potion would be undetectable and irreversible. Obliviate, you will forget that you switched secret keepers. You will forget that you ever considered it. You will forget any memory suggesting that anyone other than Sirius Black was your secret keeper. Satisfied that the spell had taken hold, he then cast a second spell, Confundus. You will hate Sirius for what he has done and want revenge more than anything in the world. Peter repeated the Obliviate spell on Lily after giving her a dose of Nemo's potion as well. Then he looked up and around, his nose twitching uncontrollably as he did. His animagus form gave him a keen sense of danger. And so he was able to hear the approach of Sirius Black's flying motorbike long before he saw it. No time for the Confundus, Lily. But I'm sure James will be vindictive enough for the both of you. He always has been in the past. Peter took cover and tried to take out Black with a stunner, but the other marauder dodged it. Wormtail, you backstabbing little vermin. How could you do this? Knowing he couldn't take a seasoned Aurora in a fair fight, Peter yelled out from his hiding spot. The Potters are all dead. Sirius. All of them. And you're next. Catch me if you can. Blood traitor. And by the way, I always hated that name. Then, with a pop, he apparated away, confident that the ever-predictable Sirius Black would follow in a rage rather than taking the time to learn how he'd been deceived and framed. November. Albus, what happened? How did we even survive? Asked Lily from her bed at St. Mungo's. I'm not certain, my dear, but I think. Dumbledore seemed confused for a moment. Then he looked up as the door opened, and a nurse pushed a double stroller into the hospital room. His attention was drawn to the sound of an infant's wailing. Peering into the stroller, he noticed two infants, one crying and the other asleep. The bawling child wore baby's pajamas in Gryffindor red, with the name Jim embroidered on the front. As he looked down at the crying babe with a still fading V-scar on his temple, Albus relaxed and smiled. Yes, I do believe that we have little Jim to thank for this. Jim? Said Lily in confusion before her maternal instincts kicked in and she rushed over to pick up her crying son. Shh, Jim? It's all right. Mummy's here. Albus, what are you talking about? Asked a dazed James Potter, who had been resting in the bed next to his wife. Well, I am quite certain that the mark on Jim's head is a cursed scar, the result of a backlash from Voldemort's attempt to slay him. It is clear now that Jim was the child spoken in the prophecy which named a child born as the 7th month dies, and who Voldemort would mark as his equal. Harry was born first at 1152, while Jim was born just before the stroke of midnight, and now Jim is marked with a V for Voldemort. Or Jim did it? Said James in wonder. It's a miracle. And while the three adults marveled over the child who would soon be known as the boy who lived, they ignored the other child sleeping peacefully in the stroller, wearing identical pajamas save for the name Harry instead of Jim. And on his brow, a rune of power pulsed with magical energies that none of them noticed. November 3rd. Peter Pettigrew made his way casually through the crowded London street, occasionally looking around nervously. He'd seen the Grim out of the corner of his eye a few times and knew Sirius was waiting until the Muggle crowd was thinner. Suddenly, he heard movement behind him, and the animagus turned quickly and darted down a narrow alley. He'd only made it halfway when a voice like cut glass sliced through the night. It's over, Peter. I've got you now. Peter turned to face his pursuer, drawing his wand slowly as he did. Traitor, Sirius. You'd know all about being a traitor, don't you? What's that, Wormtail? Do you want to make some pitiful excuse for why you did what you did? Sirius's wand was fixed on Peter, and Black had a murderous look in his eyes. I have no excuses for you, Death Eater, shouted Peter defiantly. What? What the hell are you? Whatever Sirius Black had mean to say was interrupted as a voice behind him yelled out, Expelliarmus, and his wand flew out his hand. Whirling quickly, he was shocked when James Potter whipped off his invisibility cloak to catch Black's wand easily with his offhand. Sirius's shock and relief that his friend was still alive was quickly replaced by concern over the look in James's eye, a look of absolute hatred. Prongs? He said in surprise. Then, Pettigrew's body-bind hex slammed into his exposed back. Sirius's arms and legs slammed together, and he fell to the ground. Paralyzed, Sirius could only watch in silent horror as his best friend walked up to his prone body, wearing the same look of hatred and contempt he'd worn back in school when they were dancing with Snevolus. You thought you could betray us, betray me, the way you did, and get away with it, Secret Keeper. With a snarl, he kicked the helpless Black in the ribs. The paralyzed Black made no sound, but his pain was still obvious. Ah! Damn it, James. I wasn't your Secret Keeper. Peter was, he thought desperately. But no words came. Nearby, there were soft pops as Aruters apparated into the area to tall off any curious muggles. Thank you for helping to catch him, Peter. Although I do wonder why he was so bent on killing you instead of just fleeing the country. No idea, unless he yelled out that I was a traitor. You know, Dumbledore may have known he was the Secret Keeper, but only the three of us and Lily were there when you cast the veil. Perhaps he thought that you know who had killed both of you. If he killed me as well, he could have claimed that you'd switched Secret Keepers. Merlin. What a sly bastard. Wormtail looked down at Sirius, seemingly disgusted with him, but his eyes were almost dancing with mirth. Despite himself, Sirius almost had to hand it to the other marauder. He never imagined that Peter Pettigrew could be this cunning. Where had he been hiding it all these years? So now that you've caught him, James, what are you going to do with him? As tempting as the killing curse is right now, I'll let our wonderful judicial system handle him. James, exclaimed Peter, you're going to trust the Wizengamot to decide his fate? He's the Black Heir, and now that he's exposed as a blood purist, they'll be spendthrift in winning his freedom. What do you want me to do? Hissed James. Use the killing curse on him in front of a half-dozen Aurors? Peter stepped closer and whispered urgently, You're an Auror yourself, James. I know you have a license to kill Death Eaters. James stared at him for a second. Sirius's eyes almost bulged out of his head. Potter was considering it. Suddenly, James whipped his wand, and Sirius's sleeves ripped away. James sighed loudly. I have a license to kill marked Death Eaters, Peter. Obviously, he hasn't been marked yet. Peter looked frustrated, while James stared down at his former friend intensely. Still, there are other Death Eater laws on the books. In circumstances involving high-ranking Death Eaters, we're allowed secret trials. Hell, even trials in absentia. Between my sworn testimony, Lily's, and yours, we'll have this bastard in Azkaban by tomorrow night. James, Peter said hesitantly, I was happy, honored even, to help you catch Sirius, but I'm not an Auror. I don't have a heavily warded estate, and I don't want to be looking over my shoulder for Death Eaters for the rest of my life. Do you really need oath-bound testimony from me against the Black Heir? James smiled fondly. No, I guess not. Lily and I can handle it. I will need a statement from you about what happened between you here tonight, just to complete the Auror report, but I'll have it sealed. He put his hand on Peter's shoulder. You've been a true friend tonight, better than I've deserved from you. I know I didn't always treat you right when we were at school, but I promise I'll make it up to you from now on. James turned to the other Aurors. All right, gentlemen, I want this bastard stupefied, bound, silenced, and locked up in the deepest, dankest ministry holding cell you can find. No one talks to him, and no one knows where he is until after he's sentenced. Got it? As a chorus of yes-sirs rang out in the night, the still paralyzed Sirius Black looked up into the face of Peter Pettigrew. It bore an expression of absolute victory, and for the next 12 years, it would be the first image he saw at night when the Dementors came. 25 July. So, I'm a wizard, said Harry slowly. Yes, Harry. And you're my father? Yes, said James with a tight smile. So, where is my mother? She's already at Hogwarts. She's the new professor for Muggle Studies, and is still in the process of getting her class situated. I mean, she wanted to be here. James's voice vited away lamely. Harry never looked up from the bowl of ice cream sitting in front of him. He had barely spoken to his father since the man arrived. That morning, the Dursley residence to announce that neither he nor his wife were dead, that both he and his wife were wizards, and that Harry was a wizard too, who would soon be starting at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry along with a twin brother he'd never heard of before. James had been shocked and outraged to learn that the Dursleys had told Harry that he and Lily were dead, and that he knew nothing of the wizarding world. His furious comments were cut short by Petunia's vicious response. He'd have learned the truth years ago if his parents had loved him enough to visit even once. Of course, it had been Petunia who had demanded that he and Lily stay away from the Dursleys when Harry was assumed to be a squib. But Petunia was supposed to contact the Potters at once if he showed any signs of magic, which he apparently had. That didn't make the Muggles' hateful insult hurt any less, though. And now, James Potter was nervously watching his eldest son, who looked so much smaller and frailer than his twin brother. Between them sat a bowl of Fortescue's ice cream that the boy hadn't touched yet. He just stared at it intensely, because the alternative was looking at the father who'd abandoned him. After several seconds, the boy asked the question James had been dreading ever since he'd learned that his firstborn son was a wizard after all. Why? James swallowed. It was necessary. Your brother Jim is special. He was chosen by prophecy to destroy a powerful evil wizard. We don't say his name, just you know who. Anyway, Jim destroyed you know who, saving all our lives in the process. He even resisted the killing curse, which everyone thought was impossible. They call Jim the boy who lived, and he can hardly walk down the street without people bowing and scraping before him. We were concerned that you might feel jealous of him. The magical healers were all certain that you were a squib, that is, someone born to wizards, but with no magic of their own. As a squib, you'd have been a target for you-know-who's followers, and wouldn't be able to protect yourself. So Dumbledore, he's the headmaster at Hogwarts, and the leader of the opposition to you-know-who. He suggested that we send you to live with your aunt and uncle, so you could become accustomed to living in the Muggle world. We didn't even think you were a wizard until the school generated an invitation letter for you. My letter. Right. Do you happen to notice the address? Harry asked in a curious tone of voice. James blinked several times at the seemingly odd question. Not particularly. I knew where you lived anyway. Number 4, Privet Drive in Surrey. Why? Harry ignored him. So what happens now? Will I be moving in with you or going back to the Dursleys when I'm not in school? James sighed. Dumbledore has put a lot of magical wards at the Dursley residence to keep your presence there a secret, so you can't be kidnapped and used against Jim. You really are safer there. At least until you graduate and can defend yourself, but I promise you that once things have settled down, we'll have you over to visit so that we can all get reacquainted. Finally, Harry lifted his head and looked his father straight in the eye, and for a second, James flinched. He'd always thought that Harry had his mother's eyes, but now he realized that Harry's were brighter and more vivid. They were, in fact, the exact same color as the killing curse. Harry Potter, the cupboard under the stairs, 4 Privet Drive. Sorry, are you really sending me back to the Dursleys so they can lock me in the boot cupboard again? James's mouth opened and closed like a fish. He had felt quite certain that Harry had been mistreated at the Dursleys simply from the number of times Petunia had screamed the word freak at him in the 15 minutes he'd been there. But a boot cupboard? Harry, I'm so sorry, I promise you. We'll speak to them. We'll make sure they treat you better from now on. Harry was silent for a moment. Then he slid his untouched bowl of ice cream towards the middle of the table. I'm done eating. We should go buy my school supplies now. Then he stood and walked towards the exit without looking back. At Madame Malkin's, where James insisted on buying him a whole new wardrobe, Harry met an exuberant red-headed boy who couldn't stop talking about how he had to get into Gryffindor, because that was where all of his brothers were, and that was where the boy who lived was sure to be sorted. The fact that he was standing next to someone who looked like a slightly smaller version of the famous boy who lived was completely lost on him in his excitement. Harry grunted a response and left without getting the boy's name. At Ollivander's, after dozens of failed efforts, the old man finally fitted Harry with a holly and phoenix feather wand, which Ollivander described as curious. I'm not surprised, the boy interrupted, eager to get the day over with. It is a magic wand. I reckon that's as curious as you can get. Is there anything you recommend to go with it? And that was how Harry left the story with a polishing kit, a wrist holder, and a book on wand lore. At Flourish and Bots, James Potter told Harry to get whatever he wanted and charge it to his account while he ran a quick errand at Gringotts for the headmaster. So Harry bought every book on the school list, plus every book that the store owner recommended that might conceivably help a Muggle-raised student adapt to Hogwarts. He also bought every single book mentioning the boy who lived that looked even halfway reliable. At Elop's Owl Emporium, James insisted that Harry get an owl. That way you can stay in touch with us next summer while you're at the Dursleys, said James. Harry just looked at him. Finally, he relented and picked out a rather beautiful snowy owl. Then he asked to return to Flourish and Bots so he could set up an Owl Post account in case he needed more books later. As they were leaving, Harry asked if it were possible for wizards to talk with their owls or with any other animals. Generally, no, he replied. The only animals a wizard can talk with are snakes. It's an ability called parcel tongue, and only people called parcel tongues can do it. It's a sign of being a dark wizard. You-know-who was a Parseltoth. Well, said Harry quietly, thinking back to his recent trip to the zoo and the conversation he'd had with a boa constrictor. That's good to know. From there, James purchased Harry a new trunk and set him up with an allowance of 10 galleons a week, which was apparently an extravagant sum, and which would magically refill into the bigger on the inside moleskin pouch, which James also purchased for him. Later, back at Privet Drive, James had a long talk with the Dursleys, during which quite a few threats were made. Apparently, the Potters had been paying Vernon and Petunia to look after Harry all these years, and if they weren't going to take reasonable care of the boy, then they'd be paying that money back, as well as moving out of their home, for which apparently the Potters had paid the mortgage. Accordingly, Harry would be moving out of his cupboard and into what had been Cousin Dudley's spare room. Also, there would be no more chores for Harry, which was good news as he planned to a lot of time reading the books he'd purchased. Finally, as he was leaving, James asked Harry to come out to the front porch for a goodbye. Listen, son, I can't tell you how sorry I am about all this. We should have checked in on you before now. We shouldn't have just trusted Petunia and Vernon to do right by you. But I promise you, we'll get past this and come back together as a family. Harry stared that unsettling stare again. Do you really believe that? You bet, kiddo. Harry was silent for a few seconds before replying. They told me you were both dead. that you were a drunk and were always on the dole, that my mother sold herself to pay for drugs for the both of you, that you killed yourself and mother while you were both drunk and high in an auto accident that I barely survived." James looked up at the door to 4 Privet Drive, as if he could burn a hole through it with the power of his angry gaze. "Those were lies, Harry. Filthy, awful lies. I know. I've always known that they were lying to me about my mother and father, but I never imagined that one day I'd wish it had been the truth." And with that, Harry turned and went inside, slamming the door in his father's face. One September, Harry Potter had never considered himself particularly smart, and certainly no one he'd met in his entire life had even suggested that he might be. There had been one letter sent home to the Dursleys in his 3rd year of schooling that indicated he was smart based on a test he'd taken at school and which had been graded by some education officials in London. But his guardians had been convinced that he'd cheated somehow, that a freak like him couldn't possibly be gifted, so they locked him in his cupboard for a week and let him eat nothing but stale bread and water. When he went back to school, his teacher told the whole class that he'd admitted to his guardians that he'd cheated on the IQ test they'd all taken, and that he was an awful, terrible child. And then, her hair turned blue for some reason. Magic. He now suspected. After that, Harry set for himself the goal of always doing slightly worse than Dudley in every class, a goal at which he succeeded admirably, though considering Dudley's poor academic skills, Harry had been lucky to have never been transferred to a special needs class. Once he made it a point of getting every question on an exam correct, and then leaving the last 7 questions blank, just to see if the teacher said anything. She didn't. In short, Harry Potter learned early, and well, to never apply himself academically, a lesson which lasted right up until the day he met James Potter. It was like a dam cracking and then shattering, unleashing thoughts the boy had been burying since he was old enough to talk. The first night in his new room, he set himself to studying his new textbooks, starting with potions. He was a remarkably good cook for an 11-year-old, surprising the skills one picks up when the alternative is a frying pan flung at one's head, and he thought the principles should be similar. When he first came to a word he didn't understand, what on earth is a bezoar? He crept downstairs and claimed the Oxford English Dictionary which Aunt Marge had gifted to Dudley, but which had never once been opened, and then he wrote the word and its meaning down in a spiral notebook left over from the previous year of schooling. He started reading the book just after dinner, and was surprised when he finally yawned, looked at his watch and realized it was after midnight. He'd covered 6 chapters and filled 3 pages of his notebook. It was more homework than he'd done in his life. Some people might have mistaken Harry's newfound studiousness for a desire to please the parents who had finally returned for him. Those people would be wrong. Harry had decided that he would excel in order to force his parents to acknowledge what a mistake they had made by tossing him aside, whatever it took. For 10 years, the boy had been forced to accept his miserable lot in life as well as the vital need to keep his emotions in check at all costs. Nothing good ever came of getting angry at the way he'd been treated. But now, perhaps for the first time in his life, Harry Potter was angry. Absolutely and unreservedly angry, and it was an anger that burned cold. For the entire month of August, Harry spent nearly every waking moment poring over the books he'd purchased at Flourish and Bots. He ate sparsely, and always in his room, leaving the Dursleys to learn to their disappointment just how bad a cook Petunia was. Mornings were for magic, though just theory and history for now. It was apparently illegal for him to practice actual spells at home prior to the start of school, and while James implied with a wink that the Ministry turned a blind eye to minor spellcasting by pre-first years, Harry was taking no chances. Afternoons were for etiquette and politics as he struggled to learn the nuances of the odd and insular culture he was about to join. Evens were for whatever topics had left him with the most questions during the day, plus time spent practicing with a quill, which was an entirely new but apparently vital skill to master. Finally, he spent from 30 minutes before bed practicing with his wand holster in front of a mirror, because the first time he tried to release the wand from its holster, he dropped it onto the floor, and if he did that in front of fellow students, it would be too embarrassing for words. It was in the second week of studying wizarding politics that he finally came across the law, which had actually required James Potter, under threat of jail time no less, to inform his firstborn son of his wizarding heritage and see to his education. After an owl exchange with the clerk at Flourish and Bots, Harry added Hutchinson's commentary on Wizardom and inheritance law to his growing library. Luckily, his trunk had the best and most expensive expansion charms available on it. In a pinch, it even had a small room he could sleep in, although the idea of that reminded him too much of his cupboard for it to ever be comfortable. On weekends, he would take a break by spending a few hours walking in a nearby park. Late on the second Sunday, he finally found what he was looking for, a small garden snake, who, when addressed, hesitantly responded to Harry's voice in what sounded oddly like a Cockney accent. The snake, after expressing surprise at the sudden realization that it now had a name, introduced itself as Bob, and while Bob was not terribly knowledgeable about magic, he was somehow aware that Harry was a speaker, that speakers were incredibly rare, and that no other snake known to Bob had ever met one. How Bob intuitively knew what other snakes he'd encountered remembered about a particular subject was a mystery even to Bob. Even more strangely, Bob also indicated that he was only able to know these things while Harry talked with him or otherwise remained aware of him. Apparently, the moment a Parselmouth stopped regarding a particular snake as being worthy of attention, it went back to being a normal snake, though if the speaker addressed it again later, it suddenly remembered everything that had happened in the meantime. But if Harry actually assigned Bob some sort of task, like watch over the park for a particular person, or even go find other snakes and bring them here, Bob could carry it out to completion, even following relatively complicated tasks in the process, only to revert to mundane snakiness when he was done. Strangest of all, the magic that powered Parseltongue seemed to be contagious. Bob could, if ordered to by Harry, go find other snakes and convey Harry's orders to them, which those snakes could then execute with at least as much intelligence and self-awareness as Bob himself had, while under Harry's power. The boy made a mental note of these findings, but never committed them to paper, as it was clear from James's comments that Parselmouths were held in great disregard. Mainly, it seemed that this was because you-know-who was well known for his Parseltongue abilities. Actually, Harry did not know who and said so, but James explained that there was a powerful cultural taboo against speaking aloud the name of he who must not be named. After much prodding, James finally whispered that it was Voldemort, but advised Harry never to say it aloud in polite company, or even to write it down, and so, like his Parseltongue observations, Harry did not add the Dark Lord's name to his ever-growing stack of journals. By the end of August, Harry had filled 3 spiral-bound notebooks with his notes and questions about the wizarding world, plus a 4th notebook just for calligraphy practice. He had no idea how wizards had gone so long without discovering the refillable ink pen, but he wasn't going to be the one to introduce the concept to them. On the morning of September 1st, the Potters came by bright and early to pick Harry up from 4 Privet Drive, and he finally got to meet both Lily Potter and the boy who lived. The latter was like looking into a funhouse mirror. Jim Potter was obviously Harry's twin, but he still stood almost 3 inches taller and weighed a stone heavier, most of it muscle. Obviously, someone hasn't been half-starved for the past 10 years, Harry thought ruefully to himself. Nevertheless, Harry was polite to his sibling and his mother, the latter of whom looked distinctly worried upon meeting her son, and the look that passed between Lily and Petunia, Harry would have been amused if he didn't dislike both women so much. Together, the Potters moved out to a rather fancy limo parked in front of 4 Privet Drive, complete with a driver. Harry knew the Potters were quite wealthy, but he was a bit surprised at how eager they were to show it. With James carrying Harry's trunk and owl cage, as per the advice of the owl salesman, Harry had sent his owl on ahead that morning. She would be waiting at Hogwarts in the Owlry. After toying with Nemesis, Avenger, and Death Talon, he had finally named the owl Hedwig. He told James he had found in a book and thought it sounded cool. Hedwig was, in fact, the patron saint of orphans. In the limo, Lily looked over at Harry and started to speak, but the boy interrupted her. Look, the last time I met with Dad, I was upset, and I said some things that probably upset him, and if he repeated them, but I want to go to Hogwarts and learn magic. I want to look forward to the day I never set foot on Privet Drive again. And if that means letting bygones be bygones and trying to be a part of the Potter family, then that's just what I'll do. And with those words, Harry smiled as earnestly as he possibly could, so much so that a slight soreness crept into his cheek muscles. He felt certain that the Potters would recoil from such insincerity, but they all smiled back at him warmly. Apparently, they were that desperate to believe that he could forgive them so easily. Or perhaps, they were just thick. Jim reached over and punched Harry in the arm, playfully. That's great, Hart, and listen, Dad told us that the Dursleys may not have treated you very well. But I promise, it was no picnic for me either. I've had to go through special training since I was 8 to get me ready for Hogwarts in case any Death Eaters came after me. And I've had to deal with obnoxious fans always after my autograph. We've all had our problems to deal with. The ache generated by Harry's smile became almost excruciating at that, but he took a deep breath and exhaled. That's a very good point, Jim. It must have been very for you. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Lily look suspiciously towards her husband, who swallowed nervously. Harry assumed he'd underplayed the extent of the Dursleys' abuse to Jim, and maybe to Lily as well. Anyway, continued Jim, once we get to Hogwarts and get sorted into Gryffindor, I'll be there to look out for you and help you fit in. Everyone will love you once they taint out you're the brother of the boy who lived. He actually puffed out his chest at that. Jim, sighed Lily. Apparently she had tried to keep Jim's ego in check, but unsuccessfully. James, of course, was delighted at the thought of his twin sons following in his footsteps. Ha ha! 2 Potters in Gryffindor at once. Filch will have a coronary. Harry chuckled, but then turned serious. Well, I sure hope so, but, like it or not, Jim and I have led very different lives even though we're twins. I hope you won't be upset me if I don't make it into Gryffindor. Not at all, Harry, said Lily firmly. All the houses have their good points. Right, James. All right, Harry, I promise you that no matter what house you get into, we will still love you, and Jim will still look after you. Harry sighed as if relaxing. I'm glad, and for what it's worth, Jim, I'll do my best to look after you as well. The other 3 chuckled warmly, while Harry readied the knife. After all, I am the heir. Jim blinked a few times. Sorry? What? Harry looked around as if afraid he'd made a faux pas. Lily seemed surprised, while James looked like he'd just swallowed a lemon. I'm sorry, said Harry uncertainly. I've been cramming books on wizarding culture so I'll fit in better. Don't want to make a fool of myself in front of someone from an important family, you know. And there was a chapter that discussed the Wizengamot. It said that because I was the firstborn wizarding child, I was automatically the heir presumptive for House Potter. Did I get that bit wrong? He hadn't, of course. His copy of Hutchinson's devoted almost 300 pages to discussing the Wizengamot, the families who ruled it, and the thousand-year-old laws governing succession to a seat in it, particularly to an ancient and noble seat like that of the Potters. Harry was firstborn, and indisputably a wizard. Ergo, he was automatically the heir presumptive for House Potter and would be elevated to heir apparent once he'd come of age and passed enough ODLs. Before then, James could theoretically disinherit him personally from any assets that were his and not entailed to the family and maybe deprive him of spending money during his Hogwarts years. But his education and living expenses were paid for through graduation plus a mastery if he wanted it. And at 17, he was guaranteed a sizable monthly stipend from the family trust for life. And he was guaranteed the Potter seat and all the entailed properties and assets someday provided he outlived James and avoided a surprisingly short list of sins that legally justified disinheriting an heir. Even a felony conviction couldn't deprive him of protected status unless the sentence exceeded 5 years. Lily and Jim, neither of whom seemed to know about such things, just looked back and forth between James and Harry inquisitively as James hesitantly admitted the truth. Yes, Harry, you are the oldest, so technically that makes you the heir presumptive. Honestly, I hadn't given it much thought. I hope to live to a ripe old age before I have to worry about turning things over to an heir, after all. Oh, I do too, Dad, said Harry cheerfully. Then he turned to his brother. From what I read, it seems like the Wizengamot is kind of boring. I bet you're happy that you have an older brother who can take care of all its business management, estate planning, and other legal stuff like that while you go do boy who lived things. Jim laughed. Ha ha, fair enough, Harry. You handle all the boring family business stuff, and I'll go out and fight the bad guys. Lily clucked her tongue and admonished Jim for such foolish ideas, while James just stared at Harry quietly with a strange look on his face, an odd mixture of embarrassment, guilt, and anger. And then Harry realized. He simply knew, somehow, that James had actually tried to disinherit Harry in favor of Jim, and then found out he lacked the legal power to do so. Harry broke his eye contact with his father and turned to look out the car window as the London streets flew by. He couldn't show anger, not now, and he wouldn't cry. After regaining control of his emotions, Harry turned back to his family, his mask firmly back in place. The rest of the trip was spent making idle chit-chat with his parents, especially his mother. What was it like as a Muggle-born student? Should Harry expect the same treatment as a half-blood who was Muggle-raised? Where do Muggle-borns get their magic from anyway? Harry already had a few ideas on that last question, and he'd spent some of his time between his birthday and today wheedling family history out of Petunia. But he was curious as to what a Muggle studies professor might think. Her response, which boiled down to nobody likes to talk very much about that, was not reassuring, particularly in light of the mild condescension his father seemed to have for what his mother went through as a brilliant but prickly Muggle-born. Oh, and he had a lot of bad things to say about someone named Snivelus, about whom Lily would say nothing, though the mention of his name seemed to make her sad. Oh well, thought Harry, if someone like James Potter has gone to all the trouble of giving this Snivelus an insulting nickname, he can't be too bad. Not long after, the Potter family made its way through the entrance at King's Crossing. They were delayed for a bit, as both James and Jim had to glad hand with various friends and hangers-on. A shy, chubby kid named Longbottom was there with his grandmother, a stern-looking old biddy with what appeared to be a stuffed vulture mounted on her head, and his rather creepy-looking uncle, who kept lecturing the boy about not losing his toad. Harry actually assumed that was some strange magical euphemism, until the boy pulled an actual toad out of a pocket to prove he still had it. Harry shrugged and shook his head. The ginger kid from Madame Malkin's was also there, along with a small army of relatives, including another set of identical twins, who seemed to idolize James Potter for his former juvenile delinquency, and a young girl, whose eyes were fixed on Jim with breathless adoration. Oh, and they had to stop for pictures, as the Daily Prophet was on hand, to chronicle the boy who lived as he started off for Hogwarts and so wanted pictures of him and his parents standing next to the train. This was apparently something the Potters were used to, so much so in fact that they completely forgot about Harry again. So did most everyone else, as a photographer nearly knocked him down. After a few minutes, he leaned over to Longbottom's grandmother, who at least had the decency to seem appalled on his behalf at how the Potters were acting, and asked her to let his parents know he'd went ahead to find a seat. Once aboard, Harry deliberately sought a compartment near the rear of the train, hoping it might take a while for Jim to find him. After the train pulled out, he sat alone for 20 minutes, reviewing his copy of Dilworth's Guide to Wizarding Etiquette before the door opened, and a bushy-haired girl stepped into his compartment.
Excuse me, but by any chance have you seen a toad? A boy named Neville has lost his
Blonde first year? Yeah, I noticed them both on the platform before we left, but I haven't seen either him or his toad since. Harry thought for a moment. You should ask Eka the Prefects. I think there's a summoning charm that should help, but it will be years before we're expected to know it. The incantation is Accio, but I don't know the wand movements. Or if that doesn't work, I'm sure they know some kind of detection spell that would help. Oh, that is a good idea. Thank you. Then her eyes lit up. Is that a book on wizarding etiquette? How interesting. And then the girl was off, rattling off a startling number of personal details, how much she liked reading, how she was the first witch in her family and hoped she wouldn't be disadvantaged by that, how she'd read every single textbook assigned to first years and even done a few spells, how her parents were both dentists, all on a single breath, before finally pausing to say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I haven't even introduced myself. I'm Hermione Granger. Harry Potter. A pleasure to meet you." Potter? By any chance, are you related to Jim Potter? Harry took a breath, and his fake smile slid back into place. Interestingly, Hermione Granger seemed a bit more astute than any of the Potters, and her face registered a mild concern, as if he'd just said something rude but wasn't sure what. Yes, he's my brother. Really? I've read several books about him, and none of them mention him having a twin brother. I know. I've been living with relatives since I was a baby for reasons. Reasons? Harry paused and sighed. Miss Granger, 2 things. First, I just found out about my parents, my brother, and this whole boy who lived thing about a month ago, which I have to say is a bit of a sore subject right now. And no offense, one I don't wish to discuss with someone I've just met. Hermione blushed. I understand. I apologize for any offense. None taken. And the other thing. Harry hesitated. Well, now I'm worried that I might offend you. I promise, I don't mean to, but you say you've read all the textbooks already. Have you read any books on embedding etiquette? Hermione stiffened at the preemptive apology, but then was intrigued by his question. No, I haven't. There weren't any mentioned on the list. We were given, and it didn't occur to me to ask. I mean, other than the magic, Hogwarts is still just another British boarding school, isn't it? It's not like we're moving to Japan or Dubai or someplace that different. Actually, I've been cramming for the last month, and from what I've pieced together, it's a lot like moving to a foreign country. See, there's this thing called the Statute of Secrecy that was enacted about 300 years ago that requires near total separation between wizards and muggles, and Wizarding Britain takes it really seriously. That's 3 centuries in which most wizards ignored what muggles were doing as much as possible. Most wizards don't know much about TV and movies and nothing at all about computers or the space program. With magic, you can instantly fix cavities and other tooth-related issues, so most wizards probably won't know what a dentist is, or if they've heard the word, will probably assume your parents yanked teeth out with rusty pliers and no anesthetic. Now, I don't mean to say the wizarding world is backwards. It's actually a lot more progressive than the muggle world in some ways, but weirdly formal in others. For example, wizards don't have any problems at all with the idea of a woman in a position of high authority like Minister of Magic or Chief Warlock, but a lot of them seem to get really touchy if you don't properly refer to a woman as Madame if she's married and Missy she's not. In a lot of ways, I think going away to Toll in Japan or Dubai might involve less culture shock than where we're headed. Hermione sat down with a concerned look on her face. I suppose it might, she said slowly. Is that why you made a point of calling me Miss Granger? Harry held up his copy of Dilworth's. There's a whole chapter in here on when it is or is not appropriate to call someone by their first name. My impression is that, to most people, it didn't matter, but to the wizards and witches who run the country, it matters a lot. The girl nodded at that. But why did you think I might be offended at that? Well, you're obviously smart, but you are obviously proud of your Muggle heritage, which is fine. My, mother was a Muggle-born, and, she's a Hogwarts professor teaching Muggle studies. Being half-blooded and Muggle-raised myself, I don't have any problem at all with Muggle-borns. But the last Wizarding War, the one that ended when Jim Potter destroyed you-know-who, was started by purebloods who wanted to kill all the Muggle-borns because of a crazy belief that they were somehow stealing magic away from pureblood children. And the Wizarding War before that was started by purebloods who wanted to conquer the Muggle world outright because they thought wizards were just naturally superior and it was only proper that we should rule over the Muggles for their own good. I certainly don't think you should hide your Muggle heritage, just as I don't plan to, but I think our time at Hogwarts might be a lot less enjoyable if we don't address the fact that, well, we're the outsiders here. The two continued to talk for a good 5 minutes, about what little they both knew about wizarding politics and history, about the incredibly vague definitions of pureblood, half-blood, and Muggleborn, about the vast number of unwritten rules that mark Muggleborns as outsiders, about how in the otherwise highly secular wizarding Britain it was a horrible faux pas to take the Lord's name in vain, so most people use Merlin as a generic expletive. Honestly, said Harry, I only care about this stuff because, well, because my father, James Potter, is from a very old pureblood family, and someday, Merlin willing, I'll inherit his seat in the Wizengamot, so I'm trying not to accidentally insult anyone important needlessly. Merlin willing, she repeated while shaking her head. That's going to take getting used to. Any other major blunders I should avoid making? Bearing in mind that I don't plan on changing my principles just to appease bigots. Me neither. And like I said, I don't think most wizards care about etiquette unless you do something very offensive or the wizard is a pureblood from a very old family, but better safe than sorry. Harry thought for a second. Oh, here's a big one that's important to us, since we're just now starting school. Never raise your hand in class. What? Hermione said incredulously. Well, more specifically, never raise your hand in class unless you're asking the teacher a question, or they have clearly asked for a volunteer, usually after someone else has tried to answer and flubbed it. Whenever the teacher first asks a question, he usually has someone specific that he plans on asking, but is just giving the student a few seconds to prepare an answer. My mother was very specific about this. Apparently, when she was a first year, she was treated as an outcast and couldn't figure out why. Finally, someone took pity and told her that raising her hand every single time the teacher asked a question implied that she thought her classmates were too dumb to know the answer, if called upon. Wow, she said. I would never have considered it like that if you hadn't explained it to me. She blushed slightly. Before Hogwarts, I went to a gifted school where classroom carte-simp was a big part of the grade. I'd have made a complete fool of myself if I'd gone into Hogwarts with the same attitude. Harry nodded sagely. There's a lot of fiddling stuff like that can cause newcomers to this world, like us, to stick out like a sore thumb if we're not careful. Basically, Miss Granger, you and I are about to start our first year at Oxbridge. You as a scholarship student, me as a legacy raised abroad, and neither one of us having been raised to know anything about Oxbridge culture. Hermione looked down at the floor. It was a lot to take in. Do you think, Mr. Potter, that I'll be discriminated against because my parents are muggles? Harry hesitated. I'm not sure. Personally, I reckon I'll be treated like an outsider to some degree, at least at the start, and I'll have to figure out to react from there. I'm sure some people will be biased against both of us because of our heritage, of course. Not everyone will feel that way, and even the bigots will hopefully be somewhat restrained since their side lost the last war. He paused. Have you thought about what house you want into? I was hoping for Gryffindor or Ravenclaw. Why? Do they have different attitudes towards Muggleborns? Well, all I really know on that topic is what my parents told me, so take this with a grain of salt. A lot of Slytherins followed you-know-who during the last war, and I'm sure some of their children will be among our peers, so I'd expect them to be hostile to Muggleborns, and probably to the brother of the boy who lived. Not all I hope, but it's to be expected. The Ravenclaws are the most academically focused, so you might like that, but they're very traditional and have a reputation for elitism, so it might be kind of cutthroat. The Hufflepuffs pride themselves on tolerance and accepting everyone, but the price they pay for it is to be looked down upon by the other houses as lacking standards. My father called them the House of Duffers, but I doubt that's true, seeing as how there have been more Hufflepuff ministers of magic than any other house. Surprisingly, my birth mother said that Muggleborns do best in Gryffindor. They're the closest thing to a house of rebels we'll find, and apparently they embrace Muggleborns and half-bloods just to thumb their noses at traditionalist purebloods. They're also the ones least interested in formality and etiquette, so they'll be more forgiving of minor social mistakes. Of course, she was a Gryffindor herself, so she might be biased. Hermione rose. Well, you've given me a lot to think about, Mr. Potter, but I suppose I'd better go and find Neville. Mr. Longbottom, and see what luck he's had with his toad. She turned at the door. Mr. Potter, what books would you recommend to learn more about what we talked about? Harry smiled, genuinely this time, and he rattled off the names of 3 etiquette books. If they don't have those in the Hogwarts library, just ask, and I'll let you borrow my copies. Thank you. She paused, while trying to remember how the people in Pride and Prejudice talked to one another. And Mr. Potter, if I am not being presumptuous in saying, I would be gratified if you would call me Hermione, she said with a smile of her own. Harry laughed. You are not being presumptuous at all, Hermione, and I would be equally pleased if you called me Harry. She nodded and left the compartment, as Harry returned to his etiquette book, pleased at having made his first tentative friendship. About 10 minutes later, the door flew open and Jim entered, along with the red-headed boy Harry had encountered twice before. Hey, there you are, exclaimed Jim. I've been looking for you for ages. This is Ron Weasley. He'll be in our class. Ron, this is my brother Harry. Good to meet you, Harry, said Ron enthusiastically. Likewise, said Harry blandly. Internally, he thought, oh, yeah, definitely Gryffindor. Out loud, he said, actually, I think we've already met. We were getting fitted together at Madame Malkin's. Oh yeah, I remember you. You should have told me you were Jim's brother. Well, I just found... Never mind. Let's just say it was a stressful day, and I didn't think about it. Well, anyway, said Jim, dropping into the seat next to Harry, with Ron opposite them. I'm sorry we got caught up with those photographers. It's a pain sometimes. But Ron here introduced me to his brothers, and they introduced me to the Gryffindor Quidditch team. He paused. Say, do you know anything about Quidditch, Harry? Not much. I know it's a strange combination of water polo, dodgeball, and capture the flag, but played in the air on high-speed flying broomsticks. Buka. I don't know what any of those are. But don't worry. Dad was an awesome chaser when he was in school, and he got me my first practice broom for my 4th birthday. We'll get you up to speed in no time. Harry, who had spent his 4th birthday learning how to cook bacon and scrambled eggs for the Dursleys, with the threat of a frying pan to the head if anything was burnt, smiled that painful smile, and I'm looking forward to it. Suddenly, the compartment doors opened again, and yet another person barged in. This one was a thin, blonde boy with aristocratic features. Behind him out in the corridor stood two stocky boys who would probably grow into hulking brutes within 5 years. "I was told that James Potter Jr., the boy who lived, was in this car," said the newcomer imperiously. "Is it true?" "He is," said Harry with some bemusement. "And you are?"
Malfoy.
Draco Malfoy of the ancient and noble house of Malfoy. Jim and Ron both sniggered at the boy's pomposity, but for some reason, he focused his ire solely on Ron. "I can tell what family you belong to. Red hair, freckles, hand-me-down robes. Undoubtedly a Weasley," he sneered. Both Ron and Jim turned red in anger, while Harry's eyes narrowed. He recognized the name Malfoy, and was quite surprised by how rudely the scion of such an important house was acting. Not to mention the oddly specific insults Malfoy had made towards someone he obviously didn't know before just now. Ignoring Ron, Draco turned back to Harry, but was surprised to finally notice that there were two very similar-looking boys in the car. He made a guess and hoped it wasn't the one a chocolate stain on his shirt who was presently giving him an angry glare. "So, are you James Potter?" he asked the more reputable-looking one. Harry shook his head and pointed at Jim, who had stood up and moved threateningly close to Draco. The two thugs outside tensed and readied themselves for a fight. "I'm Jim Potter," he said. "What's it to you?" Draco held his hands up to show he meant no threat. "Potter, please, I apologize if I offended you in any way, but you're a national icon, and the heir to an ancient and noble house. You're obviously going to need help finding the right sort of friends. I can help steer you away from the wrong crowd." From Draco's posture, it was clear the wrong crowd included Ron, whose face twisted into a mask of anger. "I can find the right sort of friend without your help, Death Eater," sneered Jim. Draco's eyes narrowed, while Harry watched the display, idly wishing he'd brought popcorn. "Obviously, there is no possibility of me being a Death Eater since I'm 11. And if you refer to my father, then you should remember that the Wizengamot found him not guilty. So you should speak a little more thoughtfully, Potter, unless you wish to be sued for slander." "Oh, come off it, Malfoy," said Ron contemptuously. "Your family is as Slytherin as they come, and there's never been a dark wizard who wasn't a slimy Slytherin, from you-know-who to Grindelwald all the way back to Salazar Slytherin himself." "Oh, well, that's just nonsense," snapped Harry irritably. "First of all, no one knows what house you-know-who was in, or even if he went to Hogwarts, and Grindelwald definitely went to Durmstrang. Yes, most of the convicted Death Eaters were Slytherins, but there were also Death Eaters from other houses. Barty Crouch Jr. was a Ravenclaw, and Sirius Black, you-know-who's lieutenant, was a Gryffindor. And anyway, the worst Dark Lord to have ever attended Hogwarts was Emeric the Evil back in the 14th century, and he actually claimed that it was his Gryffindor nature that gave him the courage to defy all mundane standards of decency and morality." The other boys in the compartment looked at Harry as if he'd grown a second head. You sure know a lot about dark wizards," said Ron. Harry shrugged. "It was all in the rise and fall of the dark arts." He turned to look at Jim. "I bought it to read the section about you and you-know-who, but it had chapters on all the other major British dark wizards since the founding of Hogwarts. Admittedly, most were Slytherins, but Gryffindor and Ravenclaw have each had plenty dark wizards, and even the Hufflepuffs have produced one in the last 5 centuries. Draco stared at him in confusion. "Who are you? Since when has the boy who lived had a twin brother?" Harry stood up to look Draco in the eye. "Since birth, obviously, and you were mistaken earlier. I, Harry Potter, am heir presumptive to the ancient and noble house of Potter, and that I will not be as blunt as my brother. I must tell you, Mr. Malfoy, that you have made a bad first impression. I think it would be best if you leave before things escalate into something unpleasant." Draco studied Harry carefully. "So be it." Then he left the compartment and headed down the corridor, minions in tow. Jim turned to grin at Harry. "That was awesome, Har. Leave before things escalate into something unpleasant. Wicked. I bet if you talked to those muggles like that, they wouldn't give you any problems at all." Harry's head snapped towards Jim, and his eyes lit up as if he'd been slapped. To his side, Ron asked what Jim had meant about muggles, but his voice sounded strangely far away. Jim, suddenly unnerved, looked back and forth between Harry and Ron before he finally spoke. "It's nothing, Ron. Forget I mentioned it. Hey, R, you want to learn to play Exploding Snap?" Harry studied his brother as if examining a bug. Then he considered the question, not the question of, do you want to learn to play Exploding Snap, but the much more pressing question of, do you want to spend the next 7 years pretending to smile when you'd rather snarl or scream? And he made his decision. "Actually, right now, I'd like to go find the loo," he said brightly. "I assume this train has one, if the ride is 6 hours long." "Oh yeah," said Jim. "We passed the restrooms on the way here. Just follow in the direction the 3 mini Death Eaters went." "Thanks, Jim." Harry stepped past his brother and out the door, closing it behind him. He walked a few feet down the corridor, and then, on impulse, crept back to the edge of the room he'd just left. Then he listened. "No offense, Jim, but your brother is a little weird." I know, when he was a baby, Mom and Dad thought he was going to be a squib, so they sent him to live with Muggle relatives. Apparently, they were kind of mean to him, and he blames our parents. He's being a right baby about it, to be honest, but Mom insisted I stay close to him until he gets over his anger. Whatever. Harry exhaled very slowly. Then he turned and moved quickly down the corridor and into the next car. Malfoy and his as-yet unnamed goons were up ahead. "Mr. Malfoy," he called out. Malfoy stopped and turned as Harry walked up to the trio. "What do you want?" "Potter, I thought you'd made your feelings quite clear." "I did, and to be fair, Malfoy, you did make a poor first impression. Happily, I don't make snap judgments based on first impressions, and while I can also decide for myself who the right sort of people are, I won't be influenced by my father and brother's biases in the process. Now, I don't know yet where I'll be sorted, but I hope you and I can have, at the very least, an amiable relationship regardless of our sortings. We are the future of our respective families, after all."
I find it unlikely, Potter, that there can ever be an amiable association between a Slytherin and a Gryffindor.
"Then we're in luck, Malfoy, because I think it's highly unlikely that either of us is going to be a Gryffindor." And then Harry stuck out his hand, and after a second of hesitation, Draco took it. 7 hours later, the Sorting Hat whispered into Harry Potter's head, "Oh, good. I was afraid you were going to be difficult about this." And then, in a booming voice, it yelled out,
"A Slytherin."
2 September. Harry awoke from 8 hours of wonderful sleep in the most comfortable bed he'd ever been allowed to even touch, as his roommates stirred around the first-year Slytherin dorm. He thought back to the night life. Jim had, of course, gone into Gryffindor, and actually had the temerity to look hurt and betrayed when Harry went Slytherin. The Weasel had joined him, as had, surprisingly, the timid Longbottom boy, and less surprisingly, Hermione. Poor Longbottom looked terrified of everything, and probably might have been happier in Hufflepuff. But from his observations before boarding the Hogwarts Express, Harry gathered that his parents had been lions, and that his grandmother, and especially his great-uncle, would deem him a failure if he hadn't followed suit. Still, if the boy got some confidence, maybe he could adapt to his new situation. Hermione, as he'd suggested on the train, might actually do quite well in Gryffindor if she could adapt to that house's anarchic culture. The Hat actually called Draco Malfoy for Slytherin before it sat all the way down on his head, which Harry found amusing. It sorted Blazabini nearly as fast, but took a few minutes. The Eonat, a shy, thin boy who seemed almost resigned to being a Slytherin. There were 4 girls also sorted into Slytherin: Greengrass, Davis, Parkinson, and Bulstrode. Malfoy, for the 2, were not yet on a first-name basis, quietly told Harry that Greengrass and Parkinson were both purebloods from noble, but not ancient families, while Davis and Bulstrode were both half-bloods from unimportant families. Despite their differing backgrounds, Greengrass and Davis somehow knew each other and were friends. Bulstrode seemed a bit of a loner, while Parkinson practically cooed over Draco. She hinted that Draco and she had an arranged marriage at the age of 11, thought Harry, the mention of which caused Draco to turn a bit green. Crabbe and Goyle also made it into Slytherin. In fact, their sortings were the reason Harry's own took several minutes. The Hat immediately suggested Slytherin, and in principle, Harry didn't object. But he'd spent time talking to Crabbe and Goyle on the train, and during his sorting, Harry had bluntly asked the Hat how 2 monosyllabic slabs of beef could have gotten into the House of Cunning and Ambition. The Hat hemmed and hawed, before finally admitting that it had tried to direct both boys into Hufflepuff, but it was bound by certain rules put in place during the Middle Ages to sort children of vassal families into the same houses as their liege lords. The Crabbes and Goyles, and to a lesser extent, the Parkinsons, were bound to the Malfoys by magical contracts dating back several centuries, the nature of which the Hat was not at liberty to disclose. But if Harry wanted to learn more about such things, he should definitely go to Slytherin, because there were quite a few snakes hidden in the paintings and worked into furnishings of their dormitory that, in the Hat's opinion, were prone to gossip. Since exploring his Parseltongue gift in controlled and discreet circumstances was high on Harry's to-do list, that was a clincher. Of course, the placement of the boy who lived's mysterious brother came off as quite a scandal. Dumbledore looked disappointed, as did Mum. More troubling was the fact that Professor Snape, his head of house, looked outright homicidal. Later, he would send the prefects deliver the orientation speech to the Slytherin first years. According to some of the older students, that was the first time he hadn't welcomed the students personally since any of them had been at Hogwarts. Oh, and for some reason, the data instructor gave him a sharp headache every time he turned his head. On the bright side, Harry's extended sorting also gave him an idea for how to spin his Slytherin status. I begged the Hat for Gryffindor. Honest, I did. But then it asked why, and I said I wanted to help protect Jim. And then the Hat said, well, where do you think most threats to the boy who lived are going to come from? So I thought it over. That, to Harry, seemed plausible enough for James to believe. And going undercover among the slimy snakes seems like something that would amuse a prankster like him. Harry resolved to send a letter to his birth father right after breakfast. "Good morning, Malfoy," Harry exclaimed cheerfully as he jumped out of bed. "Morning, Potter. You seem chipper today." First day of school, and the first day of the rest of our lives. With that, Harry made his way to the bathroom for a quick shower. On the way in, he passed Theo and caught a quick glimpse of the boy's back, which was marked with a number of scars. Only years of experience in keeping his head down at the Dursleys kept him from staring. Harry thankfully only had one similar scar, but it was enough to know what kind of mark a cane left, as well as to learn never to comment on Vernon Dursley's weight. It troubled Harry to realize that even in the wizarding world, child abuse was apparently tolerated. 30 minutes later, he passed through the doors of the Great Hall, which was mostly full at this point. Jim and Ron were already at the Gryffindor table. Ron nudged Jim as soon as Harry walked in, and the two scowled at him. Jim actually sneered, but he also had a strange look of excitement, as if he expected something to happen soon. Hermione and Longbottom were sitting several seats down from them. Hermione was chatting amiably with several of the older Griffins, while Longbottom kept to himself. Harry made his way to the Slytherin table on the opposite side of the room, and sat down between Malfoy and Nott. A few minutes later, the day's owl deliveries began, and a majestic horned owl headed towards the Slytherin table with a blood-red envelope clutched in its talons. Immediately, Theo Nott tensed and stopped breathing. Concerned, Harry asked if the boy was all right, but Theo did not relax until the owl dropped the red envelope onto the table in front of Harry. "Oh," squealed the Parkinson girl maliciously. "Look, everybody, Potter's got a howler." The other Slytherins backed away while still staying close enough to see his reaction. "And what, pray tell, is a howler?" Harry asked nonchalantly. Across the room, Harry could see Jim and Ron standing up to get a better view and openly laughing, so he doubted it was anything good. Theo answered urgently, "It's an angry letter, Potter, a very angry letter. The longer you wait to open it, the louder it will be. And if you wait too long, it will explode." Harry glanced around the room again. His housemates were all waiting to see how he responded. In fact, the noise level in the whole room dropped to a soft murmuring as the wizard-raised children all seemed to know what a howler was and didn't want to miss the show. At the head table, most of the teachers looked somewhat interested, though Lily Potter had her hand over her face in an expression of absolute horror. Harry chuckled. Wow, and screaming explosive letter, and a school that tolerates them being sent to 11-year-old children at breakfast in front of their fellow students. How professional. He reached forward and slashed at the howler's seal a butter knife and then leaned back in his chair casually, picking up his pumpkin juice to sip as he listened. "Harry Potter, when Jim Hick wrote to me about your sorting, I couldn't believe it. I knew, just knew. Letting you come back to us was a mistake. No Potter has ever been sorted into slimy Slithery, snaky Slytherin, and after you're down Hick disgracing our house, I hope no Potter ever is again. I'm Hick warning you now. If you step 1 foot out of line, if you give the tiniest hint that you're Hick turning evil or anything, I will yank you out of that school and want your snap, your one myself. I will disinherit you from House Potter and have you back with those Durgles, Tick Dursley muggles before the sun sets. This is the only warning you're going to get. Your humiliated father, James Charles, Lord Potter." And then, the letter burst into flames and quickly disintegrated. Silence reigned over the hall. At the head table, most of the teachers bore expressions of shock and embarrassment. Even Dumbledore seemed astonished by James's vitriol and cruelty, not to mention the fact that he was quite obviously drunk when he wrote and sent the howler. Lily Potter jumped up and stormed out of the room. Only Severus Snape maintained his composure, despite his personal delight in how James Potter had humiliated his entire family with a single letter. He waited to see what happened next. How the Potter boy reacted could make or break him in Slytherin house. Personally, he expected the boy to break and run out crying to the laughter of his own house and that of his revolting twin. Instead, to Snape's astonishment, the boy burst into laughter. "Amazing! So my dad's a drunk as well as an idiot. Good to know." And then, he stood and held up his glass of pumpkin juice in the direction of his younger twin in salute. "And nicely played by you too, little brother," he called out across the hall, with the appearance of good cheer, as if the howler had just been an amusing little prank. "Did you have to break curfew to tattle on me last night? Or maybe petty little rules like that don't apply to the boy who lived?" Jim's face grew furious at that, and he jumped up onto the table, knocking over dishes and pitchers. "You think this is funny, you Slytherin filth," he yelled, which only made Harry laugh louder as he sat back down. Finally, just as Jim was ready to yell something else, Minerva McGonagall's voice bellowed across the room. "James Potter, Jr., sit down this instant. I don't want to hear another word from you. And 20 points from Gryffindor for disrupting breakfast and for insulting another house." Jim looked stricken to have cost his house so many points before classes had even started, and he slowly sat down, sparing one final hateful look towards Harry, who was wiping tears of laughter from his eyes. Over at the Slytherin table, the rest of the house slowly returned to their seats, while warily studying their housemate and his strange reaction. His laughter over, Harry returned to quietly eating his breakfast while going over notes for his first Transfiguration class. His mood was obviously, and to his classmates, bizarrely cheerful. Potter," said Nott timidly, Are you okay?" "Never better, Theo. May I call you Theo? I hope that's not presumptuous of me. You can, of course, call me Harry if you wish. Okay then, Harry, you took that howler, well, much better than one would expect. Oh, that bit of rubbish, Harry said with a grin. There's nothing to that. Just a ridiculous man yelling at me. And I've had people much more ridiculous than him yelling at me for years and usually a lot more loudly. He took a bite of toast and chewed it slowly, as if collecting his thoughts before turning back to the other boy. For a long time, I put up with that sort of thing because I didn't know any better and didn't have any other choices. And now I do. You see, Theo, that man imagines that he's my father and that gives him some sort of right to be abusive to me. But the truth is, he's never been my father in any way that matters. And no matter how much he yells and makes a fool of himself, I know full well that he's got no power over me, that I don't allow him, and I've just decided to allow him none at all. He chuckled quietly. It's good, actually, that things came to a head so quickly. I was toying with the idea of at least pretending to be a good son to James Potter. But after that display, nah, not a chance. It's total war now. Theo looked at Harry with something very much like awe, but the rest of his classmates seemed to think he'd gone mad. Meanwhile, Harry turned towards Draco. Speaking of which, Mr. Malfoy, I know we're not very far into our association, but might I ask you for a small favor? Malfoy, who for some strange reason was mildly jealous that Harry hadn't asked to use his first name, said, "What sort of favor, Mr. Potter? Would you mind very much owling your parents and asking if they could recommend a good solicitor, one experienced in Wizengamot inheritance laws?" Draco Malfoy stared at the brother of the boy who lived, and then it was his turn to laugh. Later that evening, Harry was alone in the Slytherin common room, finishing up his homework for the first day before going to bed. His first day of classes had gone rather well. Notwithstanding his birth father's tantrum, transfiguring matchsticks into needles still eluded him as it did everyone else in Slytherin, but he'd been awarded 2 points in charms. He'd also made a few allies. Friends was premature, but Harry was optimistic. As Harry stood up and stretched, he noticed a painting above the fireplace of a puff adder curled over some books on a writing desk. Feeling slightly foolish, he walked over to the painting, looked around to make sure no one else was present, and then focused his attention on the snake. Hello, my name's Harry, he said softly. The snake in the painting twitched and then looked up at him before hissing a response. Harry smiled warmly as another friendship of a different sort was born. 6 September, after the events of the previous Monday, Jim was more subdued. Apparently, the other Gryffindors were upset at him losing so many points so quickly, and he'd also received a thorough dressing down from both his mother and McGonagall. He'd written his father to complain, but apparently James was in the doghouse with Lily over his own actions. She'd actually sent him a howler of her own that went off in the middle of the Aura's office. Let's see how you like it. And so James advised the boy to let things settle for a while. Not that Lily herself had actually reached out to Harry, who didn't know if she disagreed with James's views on his sorting or was simply embarrassed by James firing off a howler at her place of employment. Regardless, Jim and Ron avoided Harry, although he felt certain that his twin had some idiotic Potteresque plan for revenge. Meanwhile, Neville Longbottom apparently had some sort of falling out with the two and made a point of partnering himself with Harry during herbology. Harry was dubious at first until Neville nervously admitted that he was frightened of Snape and desperate to pass potions. He hoped that with an obviously intelligent young Slytherin as his potions partner, he might make it through unscathed. "I have 3 conditions, Mr. Longbottom," said Harry somewhat imperiously. 1, we do not sit anywhere near my brother unless absolutely necessary. Okay, Mr. Potter, stammered the nervous boy. Harry took a step forward. 2, from now on, you keep your chin up. You look people straight in the eye and you always speak with confidence, whether you feel it or not. Because you are Longbottom of Longbottom, heir presumptive to an ancient and noble house, just as I am Potter of Potter, and if the two of us are going actually earn the legacies our family names have left us, we'd both better get started now. And with that, he put his hand out. And 3, you call me Harry. Neville blinked several times. Then he straightened his back, took a deep breath, and shook Harry's hand. Just as you will call me Neville, I hope. Harry smiled. He wasn't sure, but he could have sworn the boy just grew an inch and a half. Initially, it was Harry who got the better end of the deal, as Neville was a certifiable genius at herbology, already able to talk conversationally about plants from the 4th-year curriculum. Apparently, the Longbottoms had made their fortune in the growing and selling of exotic magical plants of all types, and he'd been up to his knees among them since before he could walk. It wasn't until Friday that Harry and Neville made it to their first potions class, and there was a crowd outside the locked door. Theo came over to join the two. Malfoy followed with a sneer on his face and Crabbe and Goyle on each side. Harry still wasn't sure which was which. Honestly, Potter, you're partnering with Longbottom again. You're squandering what little status you have as a Slytherin by hanging with such lumps. Harry rolled his eyes. You baffle me, Malfoy. I understand why you're hostile to the Potters, though I have no idea what Weasley could have done to make you hate him or not. And now, you're antagonizing the Longbottom heir. Has your father instructed you to make enemies of all the ancient and noble houses? Malfoy's face flushed, but then his eyes hardened. I don't think it will ever be possible for the Malfoys and Longbottoms to ever be anything but enemies after what his grandmother did, he spat. Harry crooked an eyebrow and looked back to Neville, who took a deep breath, but met Draco's glare without wavering. He's referring to an incident from when we were both 5 years old, during which my gran caused a scene, and loudly referred to his parents as Death Eater swine, in a crowded restaurant. Harry pursed his lips and exhaled. All right, I can understand why someone might possibly hold a grudge. In her defense, Malfoy's aunt, his uncle, his uncle's brother, and 2 of his cousins were known Death Eaters, 3 of whom were responsible for the assault on my parents that left them both permanently disabled, and 1 of whom was the man who betrayed your family to you-know-who, so her assumption was not wholly unwarranted. Also, his father, whose family has supported pureblood policies for generations, avoided conviction for a number of Death Eater-related crimes, after claiming to have been under the Imperious Curse. I'm sure it's just a coincidence that within days of his acquittal, St. Mungo's Hospital received a huge donation big enough to pay for the construction of the Abraxas Malfoy Memorial Children's Ward. Draco and his minion bowed up as if ready to fight. Harry looked around. The Git and the Weasel were further down the hall but were looking that way. Jim coming over was the last thing Harry was in the mood to deal with. Alright, listen up. Both of you. I am not going to judge anyone I meet at this school based on what any of their relatives may or may not have done. And I'm not going to surrender the benefits of having a herbology genius as my lab partner because of something that happened when you were both 5. Nor will I blame the Malfoys for something Sirius Black did, seeing as how I looked it up and Sirius Black was one of my cousins too. In fact, I think, Neville, that he was distantly one of yours. Now then, we're all going to be stuck with each other in some capacity for another 7 years. Can we at least try to be civil to one another in spite of what our relatives think? The 3 of us will hopefully all be on the Wizengamot together someday. We may all hate each other by then, but can we resolve now that we'll hate each other for things we actually did to one another instead of relying on feuds passed down like family heirlooms? Longbottom and Malfoy stared balefully at one another when the Git spoke up down the hall. Hey, Longbottom, don't let these slimy snakes bully you around. Stand up for yourself. Neville raised his chin without breaking Malfoy's eye contact for a few seconds. Then he turned towards Jim. I don't know what you're on about, Potter. Malfoy had just come to me with some questions about his herbology assignment. Isn't that right, Malfoy? The corner of Malfoy's mouth twitched a bit, but he composed himself quickly. Quite so, Longbottom. I'm grateful for your advice. You're a credit to your house, he said doubted before turning away and making eye contact with Jim. Unlike some others I could name. Jim made a face, and then turned back to talk with Ron when the door to the potions class was suddenly jerked open. Professor Snape stared angrily at the assembled Gryffindors and Slytherins, as if annoyed there was no fight for him to break up. Inside, all of you, he barked. As the students filed in, Harry put his hand on Neville's shoulder. Neville, he said softly, I'm sorry about your parents. I didn't know, and thank you for being a bigger man than Malfoy deserved. Neville shrugged, but smiled a bit at the compliment. He was just lucky that Jim's been more of a prat this week than him. He's been strutting around like Godric Gryffindor himself all week long, and most of us are sick of it. Not surprising. If you happen to know, how is Hermione Granger doing? You could ask me yourself, you know, said an amused Hermione from behind his back. Eck, you startled me, miss. Hermione? Harry said with uncharacteristic nervousness. He had not spoken to his first Hogwarts friend since before the sorting, and he wasn't completely sure they were still on a first-name basis, given the rivalry between their houses. The smile she gave reassured him that they were. Hello, Harry. I'm so sorry I haven't had a chance to come talk to you, but I had promised to sit with Parvati and Lavender in herbology, and this is our only class together. Incidentally, the books you recommended were all in the library and extremely helpful, even if most Gryffindors aren't as well-mannered as Neville here. Neville blushed at the compliment. If you're free and interested, Neville and I have a study session planned in the library for the free period after lunch. Yeah, please come, Harry. Hermione's been a real lifesaver. Sure thing. Oh, forgive me. Hermione Granger, this is Theodore Knott of the House of Knott. A pleasure to meet you, Miss Granger, Theo said tersely. Likewise, Mr. Knott. By the time the 4 students made it into the classroom, the only seats left were near the front, and unfortunately, right next to Jim and Ron, though Ron, Hermione, and Neville separated the 2 feuding brothers. As the children settled in, Professor Snape re-entered from the back storeroom with a flourish and proceeded to give a speech, alluding to the superiority of potion-making to the foolish wand-waving of other branches of magic. Then he took row, pausing to remark on James Potter Jr., our new celebrity. Snape had also glared at Harry when reading his name out, but he made no comments. Instead, he suddenly barked Potter before clarifying James Potter. What would I get if I added powdered root of asphalt to an infusion of wormwood? Jim rolled his eyes contemptuously. I don't know, sir. Obviously not shampoo, though. The room went deathly quiet. Almost in unison, Harry, Neville, and Hermione slowly turned their heads towards Jim Potter in complete amazement. Ron was grinning like a madman, but the rest of the Gryffindors were horrified. 5 points from Gryffindor for your cheek, Potter. Here's an easier one. Where would you find a bezoar? Harry saw Hermione flinch her arm and suppressed a smile. It was apparently taking all of her willpower not to raise her hand. Sunken within the greasy depths of your hair, perhaps? Jim asked sarcastically. Another 10 points from Gryffindor. My father said you'd be like this, bullying, snide, and cruel, and that you'd probably try to make an example out of me, be asking a bunch of obscure trivia questions. First thing, he has said to call you Snevolus. 20 points from Gryffindor. Did he also mention I can do this all day? Here's another one. What's the difference between Monkshood and Wolfsbane? No idea. What's the difference between James Potter Jr.? Will you stop acting like an ignorant braying ass? The entire class, including Snape, stared in astonishment at Hermione Granger, who had shot out of her chair and was literally shaking in rage at Jim's antics. After a few seconds of dead silence, Snape quietly said, 5 points to Gryffindor. Hermione took a deep breath and slowly sat down. Snape turned back to Jim and said, more quietly, I've had quite enough of your idiocy for one day, Mr. Potter. I'll be discussing this matter with your head of house and your mother. If you will have no respect for my authority, perhaps you will show some for theirs. Jim fumed at that, but said nothing more. However, said Snape, sulkily, in this instance, we have an unusual opportunity to investigate the relative value of nature versus nurture. Mr. Harry Potter, can you answer even one of the questions to your brother? Harry coughed. I'm confident I can answer all three, sir. In reverse order, Monkshed and Wolfsbane are two of the many common names for the poisonous flowering plants of the aconite, and if I had to find a bezoar somewhere around here, I would look for an emergency kit, or, failing that, search the storerooms in the section containing animal byproduct supplies. Explain, ordered Snape. For your less educated peers, he sneered at a sulking Jim Potter as he said that. Well, a bezoar is a small stone formed of undigested plant matter and harvested from the stomach of a goat. The textbook said that it can counteract most poisons, although I don't believe it actually mentioned which poisons it would not cure. For future reference, Mr. Potter, it will not cure poisons derived from dragon's blood or basilisk venom, though thankfully those are rare. And my first question, yes, sir. Adding powdered root of asphalt to an infusion of wormwood is the first step in the creation of an extremely powerful sleeping potion. I'm afraid I can't recall the exact name of it. He turned to look directly at his fuming brother. But I do recall it was on the very first page of the assigned reading, and then Emil, and it didn't hurt at all. Curiously, Snape did not award Harry any points for his correct answers, even though he was notorious for favoring Slytherins in his potions classes. The rest of the period passed relatively uneventfully, save for one hiccup. Snape did not allow Harry and Neville to partner as they had agreed. Instead, he placed Neville with Hermione and Harry with Theo. Neville was initially panicked at this change of plans, until Harry reassured him that Hermione was probably better at potion brewing than him anyway, and the four of them would be at adjacent cauldrons. There were a few near explosions, but Hermione kept Neville calm and on task, and Harry was close enough to whisper some advice and words of encouragement. Eventually, Neville and Hermione produced an acceptable boil-curing potion, as did Theo and Harry. Ron and Jim were less fortunate, their potion resulting in a thick black sludge that melted out the bottom of their cauldron. Finally, as everyone filed out, Harry told Hermione, Neville and Theo to head on without him as he had a personal matter to attend to. When everyone else was gone, Snape looked up from his notes to see that Harry was still there. Class is over, Mr. Potter. I know, sir, but I would like the opportunity to discuss some house matters with you. If right now isn't good, I would be happy to come back at some more convenient time, but I think it's important that we address with this immediately rather than just let things fester. Snape snorted. I was right. You are just as arrogant as your father and brother. Not at all. Before this summer, I literally didn't even know James Potter was alive or that I even had a brother, and I haven't learned anything since then to give me the slightest regard for him. I gather based on things he said in our brief conversations that he bullied you when you were at school together, and I can see that he raised Jim to be an arrogant bully as well, but he didn't raise me, and I don't want to spend the next 7 years feeling as though my head of house was an enemy just because he thinks he has grounds for hating my birth father. I don't think anything of the sort, Potter, spat the older man. I know I have reasons to hate him. With respect, sir, you really don't, said Harry with an eerie calm. Explain yourself, Snape snarled. Harry Hunting. Snape blinked in confusion at the odd expression. What? Harry Hunting. It's a game my cousin Dudley and his friends invented. They'd count to 10 to give me a head start, and then they'd run after me. And if they caught me, they'd knock me to the ground and kick me until they got bored. They started playing it when I was 6. Snape said nothing. So Harry continued. In the summers, they had a special variation. Dudley's Aunt Marge would come to stay with us. She raised dogs and always came with a pit bull named Ripper. Instead of chasing me themselves, it just sicked the dog on me. I have a bite mark I can show you from when I was 7, and it got me before I was tall enough and fast enough to climb trees. From the age of about 4, I cooked for the Dursleys, cleaned for them, did yard work for them. Sometimes, the Dursleys deliberately spilled things on the floor because I was done with my chores and they didn't want me to have any free time. At nights, I slept in a boot cupboard. My medical records include 1 broken arm, a fractured clavicle, and at least 4 cracked ribs. Until I started primary school at the age of 6, I literally thought my name was Freak, because that's what everyone called me. Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia had to sit me down the night before primary school started and explain that other people would call me Harry Potter, so I shouldn't act surprised by it, but in their house, I shouldn't expect to called anything but Freak or Boy. And as near as I can, all of that happened to me simply because James Potter and Lily Potter and Albus Dumbledore thought keeping me around was inconvenient and would complicate the more important task of raising the boy who lived into the wonderful specimen of humanity he is today. Harry stood and picked up his book bag. I haven't told you any of this because I expect pity, and certainly not because I expect you to do anything about it. I've never met a grown dude who did anything to help me in any way, but I want you to understand one thing. You have no idea about what it means to hate James Potter. Then he walked to the door and opened it. Until next class, sir. Potter, the boy turned back. Snape hesitated and then sneered at him. Your hair looks ridiculous, like some lazy Gryffindor who just rolled out of bed. Get it care of before you embarrass your house anymore with it. Harry nodded curtly, and then he was gone. Snape stared at the door for a long time. Oh, Lily, he whispered. What have you done? Later, while Harry was at lunch, Hedwig flew in bearing a thick, legal-sized envelope. Eagerly, Harry tore into it and pulled out several parchments over which he started poring, absently eating a sandwich as he read. What's that, Potter? Asked Draco. Some documents from my solicitor. Speaking of which, please remind me to send your parents a thank you note. They were quite helpful. My pleasure. Draco turned then as the Gryffindors came into lunch late. Some were chatting amiably while others looked upset, and the youngest Weasel looked absolutely murderous. On the other hand, eldest and most boring Weasel looked just as angry, but it was focused on his youngest sibling. Then, Draco noticed that Jim wasn't with the rest of his house. Turning to the head table, he noticed Snape entering late, but with a satisfied look on his face. Neither Dumbledore nor McGonagall nor Lily Potter were there. Draco pointed out their absence to Harry, who just crooked an eyebrow and said, interesting. It's not the only interesting thing, Potter, said a third year. I heard that your dad apparated in just before lunch. All the Potters together, except you, of course. The boy laughed rudely as Harry frowned at the reference to his dad. Then he straightened up with an excited look in his eye. James Potter is here? Where is he? Said Harry excitedly. After that spectacle, his son, the other one, made in potions class, I imagine he's in the headmaster's office with McGonagall. Professor Potter and Jr., said Draco. Do you care? I didn't think you'd want to see any of the Potters, and after Monday, I wouldn't think he'd want to see you. Harry began sifting through the documents from his solicitor until he found a rolled-up gray parchment, which he pocketed. Then he stuffed everything else into his book bag. What he wants is irrelevant, Mr. Malfoy. All that matters is what he deserves. Total war, remember? With that, Harry practically ran out of the Great Hall and to the gargoyle that stood at the entrance to the headmaster's office. Once there, he sat down, collected himself, and waited. About 15 minutes later, the gargoyle slid aside, and the Potters came through the doorway. As soon as he saw Harry, James's face darkened, as did Jim's. What do you want? Hissed Jim. Nothing from you, little brother. Harry whipped out the scroll with a flourish and handed it to his father, who snatched it up and unrolled it. Then, his eyes widened. You filed an injunction against either Lily or myself interfering with your schooling or your inheritance, or even speaking to you without your head of house present. You mean Snivellus. Why you bastard? James, said Lily angrily. You should listen to her, father. After all, you just slandered her and your other son as well as me with that remark. You know, I'd planned on giving that to Mother and owling you a copy, but seeing your face in person makes it 1,000 times better. Do you really think you're going to accomplish anything with this little stunt? Said James. In case you've forgotten, Dumbledore is the chief warlock. He'll never let this stand. Oh, I haven't forgotten. Since you broke the seal and read the title, that alerted my solicitor that process has been served. As we speak, he's filing a motion to force Dumbledore to recuse himself from any legal actions involving our family because of his conflict of interest. After all, Father, you yourself told me that it was his idea to have me shipped off to the Dursleys for 10 years. Harry, Lily interrupted, I know you're upset about that, and I don't blame you, but isn't this a little extreme? Oh, hello, Mother. It's so nice to hear you actually speak to me for a change instead of ignoring me from across the Great Hall. And no, this isn't extreme. Threatening me in front of several hundred witnesses to snap my wand is extreme. Promising to have me shipped off to be beaten and abused by your filthy relatives and to illegally disinherit me is extreme. And doing all that just because I was sorted into a house my father dislikes, the same one that his boss, Rufus Scrimgeour, was once in, that's definitely extreme. This is just rational self-interest. He turned and walked away, calling back as he went, "Enjoy your weekend, Potters. I know I will." And, once again, he smiled. After leaving the Potters standing slack-jawed in front of the headmaster's office, Harry sauntered into the library, looking for Hermione, who had invited him earlier to join her study group. Also in attendance were Neville and several other Griffs clustered around Hermione like she was royalty. On the way in, Harry crossed paths with Theo, and he asked the boy to join them. Theo just looked back at the table, making eye contact with Hermione as he did. Then he whispered a quick no and rushed out of the library. Shaking his head, Harry walked over to Hermione's table and introduced himself to the other Gryffindors, Parvati Patil, Lavender Brown, and Dean Thomas. "I must say, I didn't expect this many people. I thought it was just 3 of us." "Let's just say Hermione's popularity has skyrocketed in the last few hours," said Parvati smugly. "Oh, stop," said Hermione, blushing madly. "Now that the adrenaline's worn off, I feel quite embarrassed about the whole thing." "Well, don't be," said Neville. "You were incredible. That was what Gryffindor bravery is supposed to be about, not acting like a braying ass." The other Griffins laughed at that until Madame Pince loudly shushed them all. "What, for calling Jim out in potions?" asked Harry. "Oh, that was just the start. At some point, Harry, I'm going to borrow my Grand's pens, just so you can watch the memory, because I'm going to treasure it forever," said Neville. "It all happened like this. 3 hours earlier. After the horrors of the first potions class had ended, the first-year Gryffindors returned to their tower with mixed emotions. For Jim Potter, the dominant emotion was anger. "Granger," he bellowed as soon as he was through the passageway, "Gryffindors are supposed to stick together. What the hell do you mean by calling me a braying ass in front of the whole class? And in Snivelus's class at that?" "Oh, I'm sorry, Potter," she said sweetly. "I'm only a humble muggle-born, still in awe of the wonders of the magical world. And when I see a braying ass magically disguised as a Hogwarts student, I can't help pointing it out."
What were you so upset about anyway? It's just house points. Nobody here cares about that except Little Miss Know-It-All.
Hermione's eyes flashed dangerously, and she whipped out her wand. Startled, Jim fumbled for his own, but Hermione simply turned and walked to the stairs leading up to the dorms. There, she pointed her wand up each staircase, and to everyone's astonishment, shot off a series of loud popping fireworks before yelling, "All prefects to the common room for an emergency meeting." Seconds later, dozens of older lions, including all 6 prefects, were pouring into the room, where an angry Hermione Granger was standing atop a coffee table surrounded by the rest of the first years, who were staring at her in amazement. She still had her wand out and looked ready for battle. Ralph Macmillan, the 7th-year prefect, was the first to speak. "What the hell is going on down here? Who called a prefect meeting?" "I did," said Hermione calmly. "You lot said if we have any questions, then we should ask a prefect. Well, I have a question, and I want it answered right now." "Have you gone completely mental?" exclaimed Ralph before a female prefect, Emily Rawson, put her hand on his arm. "Easy, Ralph. Let me, Miss Granger, Hermione. You're obviously distraught. Why don't you put your wand away and step down off the table and we can talk about this?" "Not until I've asked my question." Emily took a deep breath. "Okay then, what's your question?" "The House Cup. Is it something Gryffindor House actually cares about? Something that we actually aspire to win? Or is it just a big joke that only know-it-alls worry? Something we should just laugh over whenever some idiot costs us dozens of house points at one go? Because if it's the latter, I promise you I can stop caring about the House Cup too. It will be a lot easier to pass my Odells if I'm not dragging a lot of dead weight behind me." Hermione glared at Jim and Ron at the end, but Percy Weasley missed that and whirled around on his twin brothers instead. "Oh, Merlin's pants, what have you idiots done now?" In unison, the twins put their hands up in a surrender gesture. "'Twasn't us. Oh, perfect prefect, Percy. We haven't lost any house points yet. Haven't had time to do anything worth memorializing. I mean, we did steal a toilet seat, but I don't think anyone's noticed yet." "We've noticed," said Katie Bell and Alicia Spinnet, almost in unison and with obvious displeasure. Neville interrupted the discussion. "It wasn't the twins, Percy. It was Jim." "Oh, thanks a lot, traitor," snapped Jim. Hermione stepped down from the table and walked over to the confused prefects. "I don't know how things are going for the upper years, but among the first years, it has taken Neville, Parvati, Lavender, and myself a week to make up for the 20 points Jim Potter cost us on his first morning as a student." Ralph coughed at that. "Yes, well, admittedly, that was a bad start for Potter, but hopefully it's given him something to think about and won't happen." "Jim just lost us 35 points in potions," she said calmly. The room went quiet, and all 6 prefects stared wide-eyed at the boy who lived, who swallowed hard at attention that for once was not as favorable as he was accustomed. Then assembled lions began murmuring their discontent. The twins were incorrigible, but a 35-point loss was what they might post in a week. Not a single class. It represented nearly half the points the entire house had earned in the first week of school. 35 points in one class, said Emily weakly. Actually, said Neville tiredly, 35 points in under a minute. How? Shrieked another of the prefects. Lavender spoke up. She'd been very proud of those 2 points that she'd won in charms the day before. The fact that Hermione not only remembered it at all, but considered it just as important as the dozen or so the Muggle-born had won by herself, instantly endeared her to the other girl. Well, first of all, he mocked Professor Snape for his grooming habits to his face. Then he went on a tear about how his father and Professor Snape hated one another, and so his father basically told him it was okay to be disrespectful to the professor. Then he called Professor Snape Snivellus. Did I forget anything? Well, said Hermione, it was patently obvious that Jim hadn't done the assigned reading, but that seems almost pedestrian after everything else. Of course, joined in Neville. I'm sure he'd have carried on for longer and lost even more points had you not shut him up. He turned to the prefects, for which one is 5 points back, by the way. Ralph waved that off and turned to Jim. Why, in Merlin's name, why would you deliberately insult a Hogwarts professor on the first day of class? Jim stiffened and looked around. He was dismayed and angry that most of the house seemed to be against him. Because I shouldn't have to put up with abuse from someone who's had it out for my family since before I was born. I shouldn't have to be embarrassed with obscure questions. No first year would know. Hermione rolled her eyes. Show of hands, please. Are there any other first years who didn't know the answer to at least one of Professor Snape's questions? I knew all 3. I knew 2, but didn't know the bizarre one. Really, it was highlighted in bold in the sidebar on page 3. Oh, darn it, I always forget to read the sidebars. Other than Ron, it appeared that all of the first-year Gryffindors knew the answer to at least one of Snape's questions. Finally, Jim snapped. Shut up, all of you. I shouldn't be treated like this. The boy who lived. Yes, we know, finished Hermione. Harry was right about you with what he said last Monday. You really do think that the rules don't apply to you. Jim blinked rapidly. Hermione almost started to feel bad seeing him on the verge of tears. Almost. I destroyed you-know-who. That should mean something. Hermione stepped forward to look Jim straight in the eye. How? She asked simply. What? How did you destroy you-know-who? I've read several books about the last war. They all just say you-know-who broke into your house, stunned your parents, and then tried to do the killing curse on you when you somehow vanquished him. How did you do it? Jim stared at her, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. You don't know, do you? She continued. You've been internationally famous and universally beloved for something that happened when you were a baby, and you have no idea how it was accomplished. For all anyone knows, it could have been nothing but a magical fluke, but you expect to be treated like royalty for it. She shook her head and turned towards the stairs to her dorm room. At the edge, she suddenly whirled back around and smiled. You know, I just had the funniest notion. Wouldn't it be amusing if for all this time it had been Harry who destroyed you-know-who, and the reason your parents sent him to his Muggle relatives was to keep him hidden away while they put you forward and made you famous, just to hide the fact that Harry was the real boy who lived. As she spoke, Jim's face twisted into a mask of rage, and with a vicious snarl, he pulled out his wand, but before he could cast a spell, he was grappled by 2 older Gryffindors. That didn't stop him from screaming in a rage, though. Shut up! Shut your filthy mudblood mouth! There were audible gasps around the room. Neville took an involuntary step towards Jim as if to strike him, but Hermione called his name sharply and he stopped, his fists still clenched. Mudblood, Potter, Hermione repeated. I wonder what your mother would say to that. Perhaps we should ask her. She turned her head, and the rest of the room followed her gaze to the entryway in the far wall, where Professors Potter and McGonagall stood completely aghast at the scene before them. Mom, Jim asked. Not one word. Come over here, right now. Lily spoke quietly, but with a frightening intensity. Slowly, Jim walked over to his mother, wiping his nose on the sleeve of his robe as he went. She placed her arm firmly around the boy's shoulders and guided him out of the common room. After they were gone, McGonagall exhaled slowly before turning to her lions.
I will not deduct any more points for what I have just witnessed. Mr. Potter will, instead, be serving detentions with me for the next week. Miss Granger, as I understand it, this marks the second time today you have stood up to one of the most famous and revered figures in our society and chastised him for his atrocious conduct. That is 2 times you have done what is right rather than what is easy. Professor Snape has already awarded you 5 points for the first instance, and I will match it for the second. McGonagall surveyed the room. I don't know what each of you thinks, but I for one wish very much to win the House Cup. It saddens me to think that any of my lions lack sufficient pride in their house to share that wish, but while I cannot make you care, I assure you, I can make life difficult for you if you undermine others who do. Henceforth, any point deductions from a single individual in excess of 5 points in a day will be accompanied by detention,
as well as any point deductions caused by willful defiance of or disrespect towards a Hogwarts teacher. Am I understood? The chastened crowd indicated that she was good. Carry on. 3 hours and 10 minutes later, Harry stared slack-jawed at Hermione as Neville finished his tale. No wonder Jim had seemed so subdued as he left the headmaster's office. I hope you won't think it forward of me, Hermione, but will you marry me? Back off, Potter, said Neville with mock gruffness. I saw her first. Harry stared slack-jawed at Hermione as Neville finished his tale. No wonder Jim had seemed so subdued as he left the headmaster's office. I hope you won't think it forward of me, Hermione, but will you marry me? Back off, Potter, said Neville with mock gruffness. I saw her first. Harry, Neville, and the other children laughed while Hermione blushed once more, but with a smile. Then they set to work. For the first 30 minutes, Hermione led a review of their transfiguration homework. Everyone had been impressed when she'd accomplished the feat of transfiguring her matchstick into a needle on the first day. But when she explained her thought processes as they applied to McGonagall's methods, several of the others quickly made the same cognitive leap. Harry was able to transfigure a matchstick as well as Hermione after just a few minutes, while all the others save Neville made significant improvement. The boy was somewhat dejected by that, as Hermione was certain his wand movements were correct, but he was still unable to do more than make the matchstick a little silvery in hue. Shaking off his frustration, Neville took over the session next, answering everyone's herbology questions with ease. Then came Harry, who apparently was the only one capable of deciphering Quirrell's awful stutter into coherent notes. Harry and Hermione jointly covered charms, and then, to Harry's surprise, Lavender Brown led the discussion on potions. Apparently, despite her flighty personality, she came from a long line of potions masters, and her family held the patents on several cosmetics-related potions, and also the valuable European concession on some Asian hair care product called Sleek Easy. Remembering Snape's final words that morning, Potter resolved to ask her about it later. After 2 grueling hours, the group broke up, but everyone seemed interested in continuing to meet again on Tuesdays and Fridays for the foreseeable future. Harry, Neville, and Hermione stayed behind to chat after the others had left. That went rather well, said Hermione. Do you think this group is the right size, or should we try to add anyone else? We can go a little bigger if we have the right people, said Harry. Anthony Goldstein is good in astronomy. Apparently, his dad is a Muggle astronomy professor. There's a Puffid Finch Fletchley who is fascinated with wizarding history and actually stays awake in Ben's classes. Personally, I'd like to add Susan Bones, but that's for political networking reasons, so don't think you have to let her in just to appease my evil Slytherin ways. Neville rolled his eyes. No Slytherins to add then, and I guess I should ask, is it going to cause problems for you to study with us? He shook his head. I'm heir presumptive of an important house. I'm in a wonderfully antagonistic relationship with the boy who lived, and I've been cultivating a reputation as an eccentric loner. It shouldn't be a problem, but it's unlikely any other Slytherins will join us. At least not unless we start trouncing them in classwork. Hermione hesitated before asking, Is it because a mudblood is leading the group? Harry sighed. Well, I wouldn't use that word, but yes. Probably. There aren't any Muggleborns in Slytherin at all. Not unless one of the half-bloods is running a spectacular bluff. There are 2 half-bloods in our year, besides myself, Davis and Bulstrode, and a pureblood, whose family never served you-know-who, but I don't think any of them will risk alienating the older purebloods, many of whom are openly bigoted, and to be blunt about it, yes, Draco Malfoy and Pansy Parkington would probably call you a mudblood to your face, if no teachers were around. Crabbe and Goyle are basically appendages to Malfoy and will follow his lead. And honestly, I still have no idea about Zabini. He just floats around like some kind of social ninja. What's a ninja? Asked the perplexed Neville. Harry started to answer and then paused, looking equally perplexed. You know, it's funny, but I actually have no idea how to explain ninjas to someone who's never seen a Muggle movie or television tour. Let's just say a really mysterious, sneaky person and leave it at that. And not? Asked Hermione. I saw your exchange with him before you came over. When he looked at me, he didn't seem hateful, more like sad than anything else. Theo's a special case. I'm still working on him. He hesitated. I don't want to start any unfounded rumors, so I'd appreciate it if you keep this to yourself. But I'm afraid that if it got back to Theo's father that he'd been hanging out with Muggleborns and blood traders, Harry made air quotes around those words, he might face physical consequences. Neville shook his head while Hermione gasped. Surely not. I thought heirs of pureblood families were protected from things like that. Presumptive heirs, Hermione, replied Neville. Nod has an older brother at Durmstrang. That means Theo's not the heir presumptive, so he doesn't really have much protection from his father. I can sympathize. The boy hesitated and looked slightly pained. I've never told anyone this, but when I was younger, my great-uncle Algy sort of tried to kill me, twice. Harry's eyes goggled at that, while Hermione looked concerned. You said at the welcoming feast that when you were 8, your uncle accidentally dropped you out of a window and you bounced, she said.
Yeah, he said somewhat bitterly.
And before that, there was that time, accidentally he knocked me off Blackpool Pier. I nearly drowned before he fished me out. Officially, Well, officially, they were both accidents. Unofficially, it was understood that he was trying to scare me into using accidental magic. I told that story at the feast because everyone was telling amusing tales about how they found out they were magical, and I got nervous and told the only one I had. But I've always wondered about it because, as it turns, if I'd actually died, Uncle Algie would have gone from just being my regent until I turned 15 to inheriting the whole estate outright. And no one considered prosecuting him for attempted murder? Asked Harry. What's to prosecute? It's basically legal to deliberately endanger a child from a Wizengamot family if it's for purposes of provoking accidental magic, provided there's been no sign of it before, and the child's at least 4 years old. He hesitated. Sometimes I wonder if that's why my magic is so weak. My parents were both powerful wizards, but I almost never had accidental magic, and well, I'm struggling in all my wand magic classes. I wonder if there was some trauma related to what he did to me that stunted my magical development.
That's awful,
exclaimed Hermione, earning another hiss from Madame Pince. Do you mean to tell me I've entered a culture where it's acceptable to endanger children just to make them demonstrate magic? That's barbaric. To be fair, there is a Wizarding Child Services Department in the Ministry that looks after the health and welfare of Muggle-born, half-bloods, and even purebloods of lesser families. It's just barred by law from questioning the treatment of children who are from Wizengamot families, but who aren't established as heirs presumptive, which I wasn't until my magic saved me from that fall. From what I can tell, I was kind of an unusual case because most wizarding children show some sign of magic in early childhood. Anyway, our system of government depends on keeping as many Wizengamot seats filled as possible, especially ancient and noble seats. As far as the law is concerned, if I'd been a squib, it would have been better for me to have died young so that the Longbottom seat could more quickly pass to an actual wizard. Honestly, you as a Muggle-born have a lot more legal protections than Theodore Nott. He could be kicked out onto the street tomorrow or worse on his father's whim. You can see now, Hermione, why I've been studying this stuff like mad, said Harry. By leaving me with the Dursleys and not looking after me, the Potters and the headmaster violated several centuries-old laws. He turned back to Neville, and not to change the subject, but you seem rather well-informed about Theo's home life. I can make some educated guesses. Neville looked around the library to make sure they were not being observed. Last summer, Gran made me study files she had drawn up on all the children I'd been at Hogwarts with, whose parents were either known or suspected Death Eaters. She has a personal grudge against the Malfoys for what the Lestranges did to my parents, but as far as specific crimes, Lucius Malfoy wasn't even that bad. He was accused of bribery, financially supporting a terrorist group, and misdemeanor muggle baiting. If he took the dark mark of his own free will rather than while under the Imperius curse, then he probably murdered at least one muggle. But that's basically unprovable. He's an arrogant, bigoted snob, but compared to most suspected Death Eaters, he's relatively harmless. Neville leaned forward intently. Tiberius Nott, on the other hand, was accused of all that, plus murdering a dozen Muggle-borns and Merlin knows how many Muggles. The killings usually were, well, extremely violent. Gran called him a psychopath and said he was probably the worst Death Eater to not get put into Azkaban. Why wasn't he if he was that bad? Hissed an astonished Hermione. You can thank Sirius Black. His trial transcripts are still sealed, but according to the information that was released to the press, he confessed to putting over 24 Wizengamot members under the Imperius for you-know-who, including Malfoy, Goyle, Crabbe, Parkinson, and Nott. That got all of them off the hook, in spite of them carrying dark marks. Green figures Black knew he was done for, so he took the blame for all the suspected Death Eaters who hadn't been caught red-handed. Is it possible to see those press accounts? Asked Harry. Hermione pointed across the room to an upper floor. They've got bound copies of the Prophet doing back decades at least. Harry nodded. That would be something else to add to his studies, which already included his normal classwork, Wizengamot law, and wizarding genealogy. You know, Neville, if you're really worried that there's some kind of childhood trauma that might be limiting your magic, you should go see Madame Pomfrey. Perhaps it's something correctable. I've already talked to her about my size. The Dursleys weren't big on nutrition where I was concerned, and the nutrient potions she gave me are supposed to get me up to Jim's height within a year or two. I'll think about it. Thanks. After some more discussion of school matters, the trio separated, with Hermione and Neville headed back to their dorm and Harry to the back issues of The Prophet, starting with the volume for 1981. The thrills were unenlightening. You-know-whose death was front page on November 1st of 1981, and 2 days later, the paper officially attributed his demise to Jim Potter, the boy who lived, even though there were no actual first-hand witnesses for his miraculous feat of deflecting the killing curse. Nevertheless, it was just accepted that Voldemort had tried to use the killing curse on Jim, and some strange backlash destroyed him, leaving Jim with the Dark Lord's mark on his brow. Harry idly wondered if the V-shaped scar might actually contain some fragment of Voldemort's evil, thereby explaining why the boy who lived should be such a monumental prat. Then he disregarded the idea. Voldemort might be evil, but Harry thought he'd be much smarter and less obnoxious than Jim. Harry was unsurprised to see that there had been no mention of his status or even his existence. The traitor Sirius Black was arrested on 3 November 1981 by James Potter himself. He was tried by a secret tribunal in accordance with what were referred to as the Death Eater Laws, a series of controversial temporary deals passed in 1980 to better allow the wizarding law enforcement and judicial systems to cope with what was effectively an armed insurrection by a substantial part of the nation's ruling class. Given the influence Voldemort had, Harry wondered why he didn't just have his followers pass laws to give him what he wanted, rather than going on mass killing sprees. The Death Eater laws were most infamous for sanctioning the use of the unforgivable curses by Aurors and hit wizards against Death Eaters, but they also had provisions for secret trials, as to normal criminal trials in which a quorum of the Wizengamot serves as jury. The transcripts of these tribunals were sealed to the general public, and even the Aurors who stood guard over accused prisoners had to submit to memory charms after each trial so that they couldn't reveal the identities of any participants. Ostensibly, this was to prevent the names of witnesses and judges from being revealed publicly and thus allowing Death Eaters to seek revenge. Apparently, before that law was enacted, several judges who had presided over successful Death Eater trials had later been murdered. The article, Sirius Black's Trial, merely said that the trial transcript had been magically certified by the court scribe and that the trial had been presided over by 3 of the 12 anonymous Wizengamot members who were eligible to sit as judges in criminal proceedings, and who had all sworn magical oaths to fairly adjudicate such proceedings. Those 3 anonymous judges would decide Black's fate. The evidence against Sirius Black consisted of sworn affidavits from James and Lily Potter that he had been their secret keeper, a sworn statement from an unspeakable, whatever that was. Harry added the term to his long list of things to research, giving expert testimony that a Fidelius charm could only be penetrated if the secret keeper voluntarily revealed it, and a lengthy confession from Black, in which he proudly admitted to being secret, Death Eater, to betraying the Potters, and to placing a number of influential Wizengamot figures under the Imperious Curse. Nothing more, except his sentence, a lifetime in Azkaban for his repeated use of an unforgivable. Ironically, his betrayal of the Potters wasn't even a major part of his sentence, since no one actually died as a result of those actions. Having learned all he could about the fall of Voldemort, Harry returned the book and went back to his genealogy research. After an hour of making notes, he prepared another letter to his solicitor and sent it off with Hedwig before heading off to dinner. The following weekend, Harry discovered the most immediate and tangible benefit of his involvement with Hermione's study group. Harry had approached Lavender Brown with some embarrassment over the topic of wizarding hair care products, but she eagerly took him in hand and answered all of his questions. On Sunday afternoon, Lavender and Parvati performed a makeover on him in an unused classroom and introduced the young Slytherin to the wonders of Sleek Easy. When he entered the Great Hall on the following Monday morning, it was with the first perfect coif of his entire life. Jim laughed at him, but Snape and Draco nodded approvingly. Greengrass and Davis were also quite impressed and asked him to call them Daphne and Tracy respectively. By the following Tuesday, Hermione's study group had indeed grown. Justin Finch-Fletchley and Susan Bones joined, as did Anthony Goldstein and Padma Patil, though she made a point of sitting as far away from her twin as possible. Harry wondered whether magical twins ran hot or cold, either practically sharing a brain like the Weasley twins, or else at each other's throats like the Patils or the Potters. Harry remained the only Slytherin who wanted anything to do with the group, which was perhaps for the best, as the group split its time between studying course material and discussing the relative merits of Muggle and Wizarding cultures. The Muggle-born and Muggle-raised were learning loads about the Wizarding world, while the purebloods were learning that a lot of their assumptions about Muggles were wildly incorrect. All of the new were greatly improving their magical skill, though Neville was becoming frustrated by his lack of progress in his wand work. The second session also answered a question that baffled Hermione since school had started. What was early education like for wizarding children? She realized quickly that there were no wizarding primary schools, yet all of her pureblood and half-blood classmates seemed able to read and write several years above their age level compared to Muggles. Not compared to her, of course, but she was surprised at how effective magical homeschooling seemed to be. The answer, of course, was magic. Anthony Goldstein, a half-blood who'd lived abroad for several years, explained to the Muggle-raised in the group about educational potions and how they worked. An educational potion was, as the name implied, a potion that instantly tutored the drinker in some field of study. The number and scope of these educational potions was rather limited, as they were difficult and expensive to produce. It was easiest to create potions that taught languages, and students who took ancient runes in third year would start off with a regimen of potions that would instantly give them fluency in Elder and Younger Futhark, with more obscure runic languages coming later. Anthony had taken a potion at the age of 7 that taught him German when his father had accepted a teaching position at the University of Hamburg. He said it tasted nasty and gave him a headache that lasted for a day, but when he woke up the next morning he was completely fluent in German, albeit with a 19th century Prussian accent. Wizarding Child Services provided a few free educational potions to all British pureblood and half-blood children beginning at age 6, so that by the time they reached Hogwarts, those children could read, write, and perform basic arithmetic on a level comparable to a fairly smart Muggle child who had completed his first year of secondary school. Understandably, the Muggle-raised children were annoyed to learn that they'd spent 6 years attending Muggle primary school when the same benefits could be obtained in a few days with the appropriate potions, but Anthony explained that there were some sizable gaps in the potion's utility and availability. For example, there was a potion that covered basic arithmetic, but most wizards seemed completely unaware of higher Muggle maths like algebra and calculus, or, for that matter, entire maths-dependent fields like engineering and architecture. After all, who needs an engineer to design a building when you can transfigure raw materials as you like and then magically reinforce it no matter how structurally unsound it was? Arithmancy, a third-year elective, introduced elements of geometry and trigonometry, but only to the extent relevant to the magical implications of the maths involved. There were also potions for literacy that taught wizarding children to read and write at the level of an 8th-year Muggle secondary student, but the vocabulary and syntax hadn't been updated in over a century, which was why pureblood children who didn't socialize much had such oddly formal speech patterns. Any potions other than the ones for literacy and numeracy had to be purchased privately and at significant cost. There were lots of options for language potions, but only a few for natural sciences. The most popular one, designed for people who wanted to pursue studies in alchemy, gave the drinker a complete understanding of the field of Muggle chemistry as it was understood in 1893. The physics potion was so out of date that it was actually counterproductive, leading the unwary drinker to think that fires were caused by burning phlogiston and that vacuums were actually full of ether. There were few potions for wizarding history and none at all for Muggle studies. Susan Bones, whose guardian was a high-ranking ministry official, did not know who the current British monarch was, and none of the purebloods had a clue how Parliament worked. Finally, it was apparently impossible to brew a potion that conferred practical knowledge of any facet of actual magic, even topics as seemingly mundane as herbology or care of magical creatures, which was why Hogwarts' existence was still necessary. The prevailing explanation for this gap was that Merlin did something and so we can't make potions that teach magic. Understandably, both Harry and Hermione found that explanation completely unsatisfactory. 12 September. As Harry headed down for breakfast, he wondered if he'd need an extra dose of Sleek Easy to get through the day, for today was to be the much-anticipated start of flying lessons. Naturally, the Slytherins and Gryffindors were grouped together, so it was probably going to end in tears, and sure enough, the day got off to a poor start. When Malfoy and his lackeys inexplicably picked a fight with the Gryffindors at breakfast, one quickly broken up by Professor McGonagall. When they came over to the Slytherin table, Harry asked what that had been about. Malfoy was evasive, but Goyle blurted out that they were mocking Longbottom because his grandmother had sent him a Remember-All as a present. "And what's a Remember-All when it's at home?" asked Harry. "It's a globe that turns red when you've forgotten something important," replied Draco blandly as he buttered some toast. I suppose that could be useful," replied Harry. "Not really! Besides, Longbottom's is huge, and ancient and ugly, and looks to be made of cheap glass. He'll probably break it by the end of the week."
I thought you'd gotten over your issues with Neville.
"I don't have issues, Potter, but your brother hasn't done anything obnoxious in a week, so I've gone back to having equal disdain for all Gryffindors." Harry shook his head and went back to his daily profit. He hoped the rest of the day would be less dramatic. 10 hours later, Harry's hopes had been in vain. That evening, Draco sat down for dinner across from him, and Harry just looked at the other boy in furious consternation. Finally, Draco noticed he was being stared at intently. "What?" he asked. "And what, pray tell, was all that about?" asked Harry somewhat hotly. "You'll have to be more specific, Potter. It was an eventful day. The bit where you insulted Longbottom when he wasn't there to defend himself, then you deliberately threatened to destroy Longbottom's Remember thingy after he fell and got hurt. Then you flew off with the Git in defiance of Madame Hooch's orders, and then tried to destroy the Remember thingy, only for the Git to miraculously save it. Oh, and just now, you challenged the Git to, and I can't believe this is even a thing, a wizard's duel. Yes, that all did happen. Do you want to be my second? The Weasel is seconding the Git. At a wizard's duel, it's not even October. What are you two going to do? Transfigure matchsticks to needles and fling them at one another until somebody loses an eye. You'll just have to come to the duel and watch. Meet me in the trophy room at midnight. Harry's eyes narrowed as he studied Malfoy's smirking face. You're not even going, are you? This is just a trick to get the Get and the Weasel out of bounds after curfew. Draco laughed. That's what I like about you, Potter. Despite your obvious deficiencies, you're still leagues ahead of your miserable brother. Well, I suppose that's what passes for a compliment in this house. If you want compliments, Potter, you should have gone to the Puffs. Harry snorted. Well, hopefully, this has at least cured you of your strange obsession with Longbottom's Remember-All. Draco sneered at him and then resumed eating. Theo eyed the whole exchange silently. Later, as the Slytherins were returning to their dorms, Theo nudged Harry and whispered, "You should think about getting a Remember-All yourself, if you can." And then he held out his hand to show a small orb that looked just like Neville's, only about 1/4 the size. Draco has one as well. They're more useful than you might think. Then Theo moved on quickly, leaving a perplexed Harry Potter behind. 13 September. The next morning, Harry met with Hermione and Neville in the library. They were supposed to meet up so that he could answer a few last-minute data questions before that morning's class. But now, instead, he was sitting in a padded chair, rubbing his temples and listening as Hermione and Neville described their adventures from the night before. So let me get this straight, he said tiredly. Jim and Ron decided to sneak out to participate in an illegal midnight wizarding duel, which wasn't going to happen anyway, because the whole thing was a trap to get Jim in trouble, which I figured out in less than 5 seconds. And you went along because... Well, I wasn't planning on accompanying them, but I came out into the hall after them to tell them not to go. And then the fat lady wandered off somewhere, and I was stuck anyway, so I thought it better to go along with them than just sit in the corridor by myself, said Hermione as if that was the most logical thing in the world. And they actually found me passed out on a bench nearby. I sort of forgot the password and fell asleep. And then Neville muttered, "Stupid." Remember all under his breath, just barely loud enough for Harry to hear. So, to continue, Harry said with some annoyance, "The 4 of you went to the trophy room, discovered that Malfoy never showed, almost got caught by Filch, and then decided the best thing to do was to go to the 3rd floor corridor of certain painful death." "Well," Neville replied with a grin. Obviously, the headmaster's warnings of certain painful death were exaggerated since we did not, in fact, die or even suffer pain. But we did find a Cerberus, and we also learned that Jim has a very high-pitched voice when he screams. He laughed, and Hermione punched his shoulder in annoyance. "We also learned that the Cerberus was sitting on top of a trap door," she added. Obviously, something incredibly valuable is being hidden down there with a Cerberus to guard it. But what could it be? Harry looked back and forth between his 2 friends in wonderment. A better question would be, why on earth do you care? Dumbledore said to stay away because it was dangerous, and I take him at his head. How did you even get past the door? Alohomora. It's in Chapter 7 of Goshawk's Standard Book of Spells for first years. Harry, who had already read that entire textbook from cover to cover, stared at her and then crooked an eyebrow suspiciously. "No, it's not," he said firmly. Neville looked at Hermione, who was now blushing. "Oh, all right. It was in Chapter 7 of the 1923 edition, which I found in a used bookstore in Diagon Alley. It had a lot of wonderful spells that weren't in the current edition because they were deemed unsuitable for children to learn." "Oh, that's a relief," said Neville. "Now I don't feel so thick for having never heard of it." "So to recap," said Harry acidly, "you were concerned about Jim and Ron doing something foolish, so you followed them out and then helped them break into an out-of-bounds area with an Adel lock-picking charm. It's not illegal, Harry, just frowned upon. Besides, they do teach it in upper-year classes. You can't practice warding a door against the Alohomora if you don't know how to cast it." "Ah, so you can ward the door leading to the deadly Cerberus against the lock-opening charm that precocious first-years can cast, but the staff didn't bother to do so because, I don't even care anymore. I'll give myself a headache if I keep trying to apply common sense to this school." Harry looked over at Neville, who seemed amused rather than embarrassed. "Wait a minute. You say you forgot the password to get into your dorm. I thought that... Remember what was supposed to prevent that?" "Oh no. Apparently it just turns red when I've forgotten something important, but it doesn't actually tell me what. That seems spectacularly unhelpful." Neville stiffened. "It was a gift from my gran. I don't care if Malfoy thinks it's stupid."
Easy, Neville.
Draco was just being Draco. "Besides, I'm reliably informed that he has one himself and was actually mocking you for yours being an antique. Apparently, the newer models are much smaller and sleeker, probably a Scandinavian influence." "I blame IKEA." The other boy, on whom Harry's joke was completely lost, merely shrugged. "It's kind of a tradition for Longbottoms to reuse family heirlooms. That's why I'm using my dad's wand instead of a new one." Hermione's brow furrowed. "You can do that? Just use a family member's wand? Mr. Ollivander must have made me try 15 wands before we found the right one. And twice that number for me." He kept going on about how the wand chooses the wizard and stuff like that. Neville shrugged again, but Harry persisted. "Nev, I know you've been frustrated about how much trouble you've been having in classes, but it looks to me like you're doing fine in everything except wand work. The book on wand lore I picked up at Ollivander's says that using a wand that's unsuited for you at best makes it hard to work magic and at worst can be physically dangerous. Is it possible that your wand isn't compatible and that's what's holding you back?" "It's my father's wand, Harry. He was a great wizard, and I want to be worthy of him," exclaimed the boy, who was becoming upset. Pince shushed loudly from her desk, and Neville ducked his head. Hermione patted his leg and said gently, "We know, Neville, but you're not a carbon copy of your father. Your mother was a great witch as well, and half of you comes from her. Was her wand made of the same materials as your father's?" Neville closed his eyes. "I don't think so. I understand what you're saying. If my wand work doesn't improve, I'll talk to Gran about getting a new one." "Like you promised to talk to the nurse about your magic and your memory issues?" thought Harry, though he said nothing aloud. "Well, I suppose we should head on down to breakfast before the weasel eats it all. But both of you, please, stop trying to follow after Jim Potter and save him from himself. I understand the desire to stop Jim from costing you even more house points, but it's not worth the risk of you two getting into trouble or possibly even hurt. Harry shook his head. By the way, I never heard. How many points did McGonagall take yesterday after that broom nonsense with Jim and Draco? Neville and Hermione looked at each somewhat nervously. What? Asked Harry, suddenly apprehensive. 30 seconds later, after the trio had been kicked out of the library because of Harry's yelling, "Unbelievable. This place is absolutely unbelievable. A teacher says, don't do this or you'll be expelled." Jim Potter does that very thing a minute later, and not only is he not expelled, he gets on the flipping house Quidditch team. Bloody hell. Language, Harry, said Hermione.
I bet he's the youngest seeker in what, 20 years? 30?
Neville coughed. A century. Tja! Harry, please, think it through. Oh, by all means, Hermione. Explain what rational reason there is for putting Jim Potter on the Gryffindor Quidditch team, other than McGonagall caring more about a stupid trophy than any pretense of school discipline. Professor McGonagall. Harry. Hermione corrected. Harry actually sneered at that, which startled Neville. He was used to sneering Slytherins, but he'd never seen Harry do it before. He was surprisingly good at it. Listen, Harry, she continued. Yes, this seems grossly unfair, but think about it from Professor McGonagall's point of view. They've been using sticks pretty hard with Jim to no avail, so they've decided to give him a really big carrot. Neville looked back and forth between the two. I have no idea what you're on about. Carrot? Is this like that ninja thing from last week? Harry sighed. It's a Muggle expression, Nev. To get a donkey to move, you can either hit it on the behind with a stick or dangle a carrot in front of its face. It means that they obviously can't control Jim with detentions, let alone loss of house points. So they're giving him something he desperately wants, the status of being on the house Quidditch team, which they can then threaten to revoke if he acts out of line. Exactly, said Hermione. And as an added bonus, the Gryffindor captain is a madman named Oliver Wood, who has set up a truly grueling practice schedule, 12 hours a week, 9 more, as the first match draws near. We are playing you lot after all. That's 12 hours or more a week. He'll be under the supervision of upper year students and kept out of mischief.
Harry took a deep breath and exhaled. It made sense, but that didn't mean he had to like it. Fine. I hope the git falls off his broom. The other two laughed. I'm sorry I lost my temper. You two go on to breakfast. I need to use the facilities. The two Gryffindors said their goodbyes and headed on. Harry turned and walked the other way, pausing at the boys' lavatory door before looking back at his friends. Then, seeing that they weren't watching, he quickly darted past the bathroom before turning down a side corridor and into the empty classroom sometimes used for care of magical creatures. Checking quickly to see that no one else was there, he picked up a piece of chalk and threw it at a large painting of a sleeping Ashwinder, wrapped around its eggs. Esme, wake up! With a hiss, the fiery serpent raised its head and hissed at Harry, the corona of flame around its head, lighting up the whole room. I'm sorry for waking you, but this is important. What have the other snakes been saying about the locked room in the third floor corridor? You know, the one with the three-headed dog in it. 31 October. As the Slytherin first years got ready for the day, Harry laid in his bed, deep in thought. Today was Halloween in the Muggle world. He supposed it was in the Wizarding world too, but it was also Victory Day, the day Jim Potter vanquished you-know-who. Tonight's feast would likely be particularly impressive, since it was the Git's first year at Hogwarts. The carrot had apparently worked. Jim had not suffered any serious point losses since joining the Quidditch team, and appeared to have buckled down on his studies. Appeared being the operative word, of course. Now that he knew that tantrums would get him nowhere, Jim had become a bit more, well, Slytherin in his approach. He'd ingratiated himself with the Weasley Terrors, as the Slytherins dubbed the twins, and good friends that they were. They'd taken to pranking the snakes, and Harry, in particular, a vengeance. Particularly notable was the morning Harry spent forced to walk backwards everywhere, not to mention the 2 days that the entire first-year Slytherin class had been compelled to refer to each other as Junior Death Eater every time they spoke to one another. The twins rarely pranked Neville and Hermione out of house loyalty, but there was something of a cold war amongst the Gryffindor firsties, with Neville and the girls on one side and the rest of the boys on the other. Dean had even stopped coming to the study sessions. Exacerbating things was the fact that Neville was still making no progress in his own wand work, yet he refused to consult with his grandmother about the issue of his wand. He hadn't quit the study group, but he now barely even tried in charms and transfiguration. Naturally, this had resulted in him losing some points for lack of effort and eventually a howler from his grandmother during lunch the previous week. All of which suddenly made Harry's position in his own house a bit more precarious. He was doing well academically and still held the advantages of being the Potter heir, though his solicitor advised that James Potter was still looking for grounds to disinherit him. But his reputation was no longer mysterious eccentric loner,
but rather loser on the outs with his family, whose only friends were other losers. Largely as a consequence, Daphne and Tracy had rather coolly advised him that they were back on a last-name basis. So it was a somewhat downbeat Harry Potter who walked with his dorm mates to breakfast. Up ahead, in front of the Great Hall, he noticed the Weasley twins waiting and watching. Then to his right, he heard a soft hiss from the tapestry depicting St. Patrick purging the snakes out of Ireland. Harry stopped and then took a running jump to clear the group of floor tiles that the snake had warned were hexed. "Potter, do stop acting like a muggle fool," drawled Draco from just behind him. Then there was a crackle of magic followed by cries of dismay. Harry turned around. Malfoy, Crabbe, Goyle, and Parkinson all now had hair, the color of Gryffindor, red with golden eyebrows to match. "The Weasley terrors," Harry said in a bored voice. "And fairly obvious this time. Do at least try to be aware of your surroundings, Malfoy. Now, I suggest you go to infirmary before whatever that stuff is soaks in. That or you can look like lost Weasley cousins the rest of the week." Draco snarled at Harry, and then he, his two bookends, and his whatever pansy was stormed off to the infirmary. Daphne Greengrass sidled up to Harry and looked at him with curiosity. "How did you know the Weasleys had put a trap there?" she asked. Harry shrugged and then lied. "Just something we losers figured out in our loser study group. I'm sure someone as clever as you would have figured out on your own. If not, you'd look lovely with bright red hair." She huffed and headed on to breakfast. Harry then turned and walked boldly in the twins' direction, hoping that Eilbert's memory and eye for detail were as good as he claimed. Eilbert being the snake hanging from the tree in the background of a painting on the 3rd floor, who claimed to have observed the twins and picked up some juicy gossip from it. "Gentlemen, a moment of your time." The twins, who had been both amazed and annoyed at how casually he'd evaded their prank, straightened up. "Oh? And what might us two, innocent little Gryffies, want to say to a mean little snake like you?" Harry sighed. Part of him wondered if he and Jim would have the same back-and-forth patter down if they'd lived together. Another part of him was suddenly grateful to the Dursleys for preventing just that outcome. "Well, I'd like to try diplomacy for a start. Have I, in fact, done anything to anger you two or to deserve the somewhat aggressive level of pranking I've had to put up with for the last month? Because if so, I apologize and I'm happy to make amends. If not, of course, I'll have to assume the worst, that you two have simply agreed to become Jim's attack dogs and come after me for no reason but his pettiness." "Gryffindors stick together, little snaky Potter," said one of them with surprising coldness. So it had been Jim. Harry guessed that meant it was time for the stick. "Well, Slytherins don't. So you can go after my housemates to your heart's content, but leave me out of it because, well, I do apologize for making threats. It's really not my style. But so help me, if one more hex or jinx or prank hits me and I think you are responsible." He hesitated for emphasis as the twins looked at him smugly. "I'll tell Snape about the map." That got their attention. And while the twins were pretty good at acting innocent, they were not prepared for a first-year Slytherin threatening their most treasured secret. After a few seconds of eye-goggling, one of them, the one with the tiny mole next to his left eye, Harry noted for future reference, finally said nervously, "What map?" "Oh, do you have more than one? The one I'm talking about is activated by, what were the words? Something like, I swear I'm up to no good." "No, I solemnly swear I'm up to no good." That's how it goes, right? The twins were even more shocked at that, and inwardly, Harry was singing Egbert's praises for his perception and memory. "Look, guys, I don't want to be your enemy. To be honest, I'm a fan of your work. Well, when it's not directed at me and when you don't cross the line from playful amusement to cruel bullying." They actually looked a bit hurt at that, so Harry decided to offer the carrot as well. "In fact, I think if you had a bit of financial support, you could take your work to the next level." Their eyebrows shot up and the one without a mole asked, "Are you offering us a bribe to not prank you?" Harry made a point of looking mildly offended. "I'll make you a deal. You don't call it a bribe, and I won't call it paying protection money. A galleon a week. You need me out of your pranks. If Jim asks you to prank me, tell him that Snape has been looking out for me and it's too risky or something like that. And before you ask, no, I will not help you prank any other Slytherins." They looked at one another before saying in unison, 2 galleons. "A galleon and 8 sickles. And for that price, you also leave Theonat alone as well. He doesn't deserve it." They both stiffened. "His father was a Death Eater," said Mo Weasley. "I know," Harry said calmly, "and believe me when I say that fate played him a crueler trick by giving him that bastard for a father than you could come up with on your worst days." Their eyes widened and then they nodded solemnly. They understood. It's a deal. No pranks or jokes on it to go firsty Snake Potter or ickle firsty Snake not. They even shook on it. "Now then, tell us, how did you find out about the map?" He leaned in conspiratorially. "Let's just say, Snake, spelled sideways, is snake. Until next time, gentlemen." And with that, he walked away, whistling, not even knowing how much quiet admiration he'd earned from 2 future allies. Neville was, as usual, on top of his game in herbology, winning 2 points for Gryffindor. Nevertheless, Harry noticed he was tense and asked the boy about it. But he didn't want to talk. Instead, after waiting until most of the class had left, he asked Harry if he would mind skipping lunch to help him with the levitation charm which they would be covering in charms. Hermione had been helping him to no avail, so he thought Harry might have some insights as he'd been the first Slytherin to master it the day before. Unfortunately, as they were leaving the greenhouse, an unwelcome voice intruded. "That snake won't be able to help you, Squib," said Jim from behind them. "Heck, he's not much more than a squib himself." "Our points earned so far would seem to show who's the better wizard, little brother," Harry said mildly. Jim's eyes flared. "Points aren't everything, and while your little study group has been playing around, I've been getting real lessons from the upper years on the Quidditch team." He whipped his wand, waved it, and said, "Accio remember all." To Harry and Neville's surprise, the glass globe slipped out of Neville's pocket and floated lazily through the air and into Jim's hand. "That was a fifth-year summoning spell, by the way." Jim smirked and then looked down at the globe in his hand. "I still remember the day I first saw this thing. Longbottom, while your buddy Harry was standing around slack-jawed, afraid to stand up to a filthy Death Eater wannabe like Malfoy, I was up in the air, facing him head-on, risking my life to get this back to you." He took a few steps towards Neville and Harry, idly tossing the rememeral in his hand as he did. "I know I was kind of a jerk in the beginning, but I'm sorry, and I've gotten better, both at not acting out like I was, and at working magic. Forget Harry and Granger and their stupid little club. Let me help you." He looked down smugly at the Rememberall. "After all, I've just proven that I'm better at magic than Accio Rememberall." Suddenly, it was Jim's turn to be surprised, as the orb shot out of his hands like a rocket and slapped into the waiting hand of Hermione, who had been standing out to the side out of sight. Harry smiled, while Jim stared dumbfounded. "Nicely done," said the Slytherin. "When did you learn that spell?" "Just now?" "Well, you told me the incantation on the train, but didn't know the wand pattern, which Jim kindly just demonstrated. It's not really hard at all, just a double reverse swish as you say Accio, and then a 10-degree above horizontal flick in the direction of the target object as you describe what it is. Mass and especially range will probably be quite limited until we're older and our magic is stronger, but the basic spell is simple enough for nearby objects you can clearly see." Harry considered that, and then lashed out with his own wand. "Accio, remember all." The orb then shot out of Hermione's hand and into his own just as fast as it had for her. "Wow, that was easy." He looked up at Jim smugly. "Thanks, little brother. You're a really good teacher." Jim was speechless. It had taken him 2 days to master the charm that Hermione and his brother had just performed effortlessly after watching him demonstrate it once. Finally, he shook off his surprise in favor of anger. "Go to hell, Snake," he said, "and you two traitors can go with him." Then he turned and stalked off. Harry shook his head and handed the Rememberall to Neville, but he was surprised when the orb immediately turned a very dark and angry red that almost seemed to shimmer and pulse angrily in Neville's hand. Has it been doing that?" "Yeah, for the last few days," said Neville quietly. "Makes sense. I forget more than I remember, it seems." "Come on, Nev, don't let Jim get you down," said Harry. "He's not, Harry," Neville said curtly. "You two are." Harry and Hermione looked at one another. Excuse me," Harry said. He exhaled in frustration. Jim just did a 5th-year spell, which was impressive enough even if he had upperclassmen teach it to him. You two? You just learned it yourselves just from watching him do it once. And you do it better than him. Meanwhile, I can't do anything in the first-year spell book. He started walking away from the other two. "I'm thinking maybe I should write to Uncle Algy and see if there's a way for me to voluntarily step down as heir and just pass the lordship directly to him." Jim was right. "I am a squib in every way that matters." "Neville!" exclaimed Hermione. "You can't give up. Look, I'm grateful for all you've tried to do for me, both of you, but I just can't deal with this anymore, and I'm tired of feeling pitied. From now on, just leave me alone and concentrate on the others in the group. They might actually get something out of it." And with that, he left. After a worried look passed between them, Harry and Hermione followed their friend towards the castle. Neither noticed Theo not standing at the corner of the greenhouse, a look of deep concern on his face. Neville didn't show up at lunch, but Hermione sat next to him during charms, which the Gryffindors shared with the Hufflepuffs. His hours spent revising helped a little. He was able to perform most of the very basic charms that the class had learned in September, although clearly not at the same level of power or control that his classmates had. Problems started when Professor Flitwick introduced the new charm of the day, the levitation charm. The incantation was Wingardium Leviosa, which Neville got after a single whispered correction from Hermione, and she assured him that his wand movements were correct. Despite all that, however, the feather sitting on his desk resolutely refused to move. Unsurprisingly, Hermione was the first to achieve a proper result. Her feather floated up gracefully and then danced around the ceiling in response to her wand movements. The small gaggle of Gryffindor and Hufflepuff girls, for whom Hermione had become a role model, all clapped, and Flitwick awarded Gryffindor 3 points. Across the room, Jim and Ron rolled their eyes. Then Flitwick turned to Neville, who swallowed and then looked down at his feather as if it were a poisonous snake. He raised his wand to cast the spell, perfectly, as far as Hermione could tell, and focused all of his will upon the feather. Nothing happened. But Neville didn't release the spell. Instead, without taking his wand off the feather, he concentrated harder and poured more and more of his magical power into the spell he'd cast. He gritted his teeth painfully, and a bead of sweat appeared on his forehead. The feather shook slightly, his face contorted into a mask of concentration and even pain, causing both Hermione and Flitwick to become alarmed. Neville paid them no mind. All of his attention was bent towards the feather, which had started to rock slightly as if striving to become airborne. When Hermione called out his name rather loudly, he ignored her. He also ignored the tickling sensation just below his nose and the strange coppery taste on his lips. Finally, as his vision began to blur, the feather slowly began to rise off the table, 1 inch, 2 inches, 3, before it suddenly burst into flame, causing him to lose the spell. He sat back in his chair, exhausted and shaking. Instinctively, he rubbed his hand over his mouth and was startled to realize that his nose was bleeding. Then he looked up and saw the whole class was staring at him, including a visibly shaken Flitwick. "Are you quite all right, my boy?" he asked gently. Neville swallowed deeply and wiped his nose again. I'm not feeling very well, Professor. May I be excused for a bit?" Flitwick hesitated and then nodded. "Take as much time as you need, and if you don't feel better quite soon, I want you to go to the infirmary. Understood?" Neville nodded, snatched up his book bag, and fairly fled the classroom. Just before he walked out, though, he turned back to look at his classmates. Jim Potter was looking right at him, smirking, and then the boy who lived mouthed a single word that Neville didn't need to hear to understand. Squib. Neville walked out the door and did not return to class that day. Hours later, Theo Knott stepped into a restroom to wash his hands before dinner and was surprised to find Neville sitting on the floor in the corner, staring vacantly at his wand. His face was clean from his earlier nosebleed, but it was obvious he'd been crying. Theo looked around to make sure no one else was in the room before he tentatively spoke. Are you all right?" Neville didn't even look up. "I'm fine, just leave me alone." Theo started to leave, but then hesitated and turned back towards other boy. I noticed your remember all this morning after herbology. It was, red. Very red. And also pulsing. Yeah. Neville laughed bitterly. "Apparently, I'm very forgetful." Theo bit his lip anxiously. Then, he moved a bit closer and knelt down to the floor so he could make eye contact. "Longbottom, Neville, has anyone ever explained to you what a remember all is actually for?" Neville just stared at him without comprehension. Oh dear. Theo thought to himself. At dinner that evening, Harry was digging into some cottage pie when Malfoy nudged him slightly. "Your mudblood friend is making a spectacle of herself trying to get your attention." Harry glared at him. "I don't appreciate the use of that word, Malfoy." Draco glared back. "I don't appreciate housemates who have greater loyalty to Gryffindors than Slytherins. And yet here we are. It's interesting that you're so concerned for my loyalty to the house when you've worked so hard to isolate me within it, Malfoy." Before Malfoy could respond, a paper airplane landed on the table between the two of them, narrowly missing the gravy bowl. The words "to Harry" from Hermione were written on it. The two boys looked up from the airplane's direction to see Hermione waving at him. "That's it," said Malfoy with a sneer. "Crabbe, Goyle, Pansy, we're moving. It's getting a bit too muddy around here." The 4 Slytherins relocated to the far end of the table. On the other side, all the other first-year Slytherins save Theo moved as far away from Harry as was possible. Harry frowned. He had hoped to lay low within Slytherin House for a while longer and continue learning the house's secrets before he made any sort of power play. Unfortunately, Malfoy seemed bent on forcing the issue, so a confrontation would likely happen quite soon. It was annoying. Harry turned his attention to Hermione's airplane, which he unfolded to reveal a blank page. To his surprise, words in Hermione's elegant script faded into view. "Harry, do you know where Neville is? I'm very worried about him. Tap the parchment 3 times and whisper your response, and then tap the parchment twice more to send it back to me." Harry's eyebrows shot up in surprise, and then he replied,
"I haven't seen him since herbology. How are you doing this?"
"A modified switching spell linking your parchment to the one I'm writing on. It's out of the 3rd year curriculum, though I think this adaptation is from 5th year. Harry chuckled. How these idiot purebloods could even pretend to be superior while muggle-born prodigies like Hermione stocked the school was a mystery to him. "What is that?" asked Theo. "Oh, just Hermione. Once again, proving that everything Draco thinks about blood purity is bollocks. By the way, have you by any chance seen Neville recently?" Theo coughed nervously. "I saw him about an hour ago. He was in the 1st floor boys' bathroom. He was very upset." "Yeah, I heard something happened in Charms and he had to leave class, but I haven't gotten any details." Theo chewed his lip again. "It was more than that. Harry, do you know what a remember all is for? Because Longbottom didn't until I told him earlier. I realized he didn't and thought he ought to know. I hope I didn't make a mistake by telling him." Harry was confused, but also suddenly concerned. "Neville told me that a remember all lets you know when you've forgotten something important." "Yes, but it's more than that." Theo looked around conspiratorially. In the mid-1700s, a spell came into widespread usage called the memory charm, followed soon after, at its close relative, the false memory charm. The former creates a targeted amnesia in someone. The later replaces the erased memories with new ones of the spellcaster's choice. They caused a lot of problems at first, until the ministry passed laws heavily regulating them. In fact, they were nearly declared unforgivables, but they were deemed too valuable for use on muggles in preserving the statute of secrecy to ban so completely. They aren't taught at Hogwarts, and you're supposed to get licensed by the ministry to learn and use them, but there are plenty of old families which have preserved them in grimoires, so they're still available to learn illegally if you have the right contacts. And the Remember All protects against them? Not exactly, it just lets you know when you've been hit by one. It's kind of a tradition in wealthy old pure-blood families, especially the paranoid ones, to gift them to children starting at Hogwarts. Only the rich ones though, because they're pretty expensive. It's to hopefully prevent children from being mentally manipulated until they're old enough to develop psychic defenses. They turn a pale red if you've forgotten something naturally, a dark red if you've had memories erased or altered through magic, Theo swallowed, and a very dark red if you've had lots of memories affected that way. Harry paled, like Neville's did earlier today. Can these memory alterations be reversed? That's another thing Remember Alls do. If you carry one with you at all times, it can gradually reconstruct memories that have been erased or altered by magic. It may take a long time depending on how extensive the alterations are and how powerful the wizard was that cast the spell. That's what the glow meant this afternoon. Longbottom's Remember All has finally reconstructed his true memories and is ready to restore them. Harry inhaled sharply. Did you tell Neville how to do that?
Theo grimaced.
Yes. For what it's worth, I did tell him that he should probably have someone with him when he restored his memories in case they were traumatic, but he insisted on doing it alone. I guess I should have come and told you anyway, but it seemed kind of personal to him. Maybe so, but you still should have come and told me. Well, I'm sorry, said Theo hotly. I'm not used to all this kindness stuff. I wasn't raised for it. Harry smiled. I don't know, Theo. I think you might just have a knack for it. Then he turned back to the parchment, tapped it, and whispered another message. Neville is in the first floor boys' toilets. He's very upset. I'll explain why on the way. We'll go as soon as the feast is over. But just as Harry sent the message, the doors to the Great Hall flew open, and Professor Quirrell entered in a panic. Quirrell, in the dungeon. Thought you ought to know. And then the silly man fainted. Harry exhaled loudly. Bugger. There was a brief moment of school-wide panic, which the headmaster shut down before commanding the students to return to their dorms. Harry tapped the parchment again. Strike that. We go now. Slip away from the other Griffs and meet me outside the Great Hall doorway. Hermione nodded at him from across the room and then rose to leave with her house. Harry also rose, but then Rodney Montague, the seventh-year Slytherin prefect, called out to his house, Slytherins, sit back down. Our illustrious headmaster in his haste has apparently forgotten that our dorms, like the Hufflepuffs, are in the dungeons. Ergo, we shall remain here in the Great Hall, and once the Lions and Eagles have left, the prefects will seal the doors and ward them. No one, whether human or troll, will get in or out until the crisis is over. Understood? The Slytherins all sat down. Double bugger, spat Harry ruefully. He closed his eyes and started muttering to himself as he rubbed his temples. Need a distraction. Need a distraction. Think. Theo leaned in and put a hand to his shoulder. Seriously? He whispered urgently. Are you seriously considering sneaking out of here, defying the prefects, and running off to find Lenbottom when there's a troll on the loose? Harry opened his eyes and looked at Theo. Neville is my friend, and he's in trouble, so I'm there for him, just like you're my friend, and if you're ever in Teal, I'm there for you. Harry had said it matter-of-factly and without thinking, so he was surprised when Theo jerked back, his eyes widening in surprise. Then, with a twinge of sadness, Harry realized the other boy had probably never had anyone offer him that degree of friendship before. Theo looked around and then put his hands under the table so no one could see as he removed the silver ring he always wore. He handed it stealthily to Harry. Put it on the third finger of your left hand. Then, when you're ready, take a deep breath and give it a half twist, and then move. It will only last while you do your breath, and then it will have to recharge for a while. And when you next take a breath, everyone here will immediately notice you're gone. Now go. Surprised, Harry put the ring on his finger, took the deepest breath he could, and twisted the ring. Nothing happened. He looked around, and no one was paying him any mind. Slowly, he stood. No one turned in his direction. Carefully, he stepped over the bench and moved towards the door. When it was clear that everyone was ignoring him completely, he ran, slipping through the gap, just as the Slytherin and Hufflepuff prefects were closing the doors. As he ducked out, he noticed that Professor Quirrell was no longer laying on the floor where he'd fainted. Harry continued to hold his breath until he caught up with Hermione, who was hiding behind a suit of armor watching the receding troop of Gryffindors as they headed towards their tower. Then, when his lungs were burning and he could hold it no longer, he let go with a gasp, and the girl jumped with a small eek. Harry, how did you do that? Surely invisibility spells are too powerful to cast at our age. Let's just say, said Harry between gasps of air, that it was through the power of friendship and leave it there for now. Come on, we have to get to Neville. On the way to the restroom, Harry filled Hermione in on what Theo had said about Neville's remember-all. So someone has been tampering with Neville's memories on a repeated basis. I wonder if that's why his memory is so poor generally. Probably, Harry said grimly. Suddenly, the two were stopped by a noxious stench that almost made them both gag. From around the corner, they could hear a growl, the sound of Waitian stonework, and Neville Longbottom yelling of absolute terror. Harry muttered bitterly under his breath, "Troll in the dungeon. Thought you ought to know."